Hey guys, tonight we're cracking open one of history's most whispered about topics, what S3X was actually like in medieval Europe. Spoiler, it's not hot, it's not romantic. And honestly, you probably won't survive this, socially or medically, but it is fascinating, weird and full of wild contradictions, and in true bedtime history fashion, it's also a little bit boring, which is exactly what your sleep-deprived brain needs right now. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I mean it! Also, let me know in the comments, what city are you watching from, and what time is it right now where you are? Midnight in Manchester? 2 AM in Toronto? I want to know. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not in the medieval world yet, not fully, but you're close. The air gets colder. Your shoes, if you have any, start feeling less comfy, more crunchy. You hear the clop of a horse's hooves somewhere off in the mist, but mostly it's quiet. Too quiet. Welcome to Western Europe, somewhere around the year 1287. You're standing in a small village, muddy pathways, thatched roofs, smoke curling up from peat fires. Chickens waddle around like they own the place, and they kind of do. The air smells like boiled onions, damp wool, and the lingering aftermath of livestock. Cozy, right? Now forget the candlelit romances of medieval dramas. Forget flowing gowns, poetic nights, and passionate kisses under moonlit towers. What you're really walking into is a world where S3X is rarely private, rarely clean, and almost never about pleasure, especially not yours. Your lodging tonight? A peasant hut. It's about the size of your bathroom, and your bathroom is doing better in the ventilation department. The roof leaks in spring, the floor is packed earth, and you sleep on a lumpy straw mattress with your entire family, parents, siblings, maybe a grandparent or two, plus a few helpful mice. And yes, the family goat is inside. It's too valuable to leave outside with the wolves. Now try imagining anything intimate happening in that setting. You want to make a move on your spouse? Good luck with 6 eyeballs watching, plus the goat judging you from the corner. In medieval peasant households, there wasn't really a bedroom so much as a bed in room. Privacy was a luxury, and for 90% of the population, that luxury didn't exist. Curtains? Nope. Separate quarters? Not unless you're royalty. Even married couples had to be creative. Some waited until the kids were asleep. Others stole moments in the barn. And yes, plenty just did it with everyone around and pretending not to notice. Just face the wall, Grandma. Now, it wasn't always this grim. Some homes had loft spaces, a kind of upper shelf where older kids or parents might sleep. But even then, sound carries. You drop a shoe up there and the whole house hears it. So yeah. Not exactly the sexy chamber music you were picturing, but while physical privacy was a rare treat, emotional privacy wasn't a thing either. Marriages, especially among peasants, were as much about survival as affection. Who owns what land? Can your family support a joint farm? Is someone's pig herd large enough to count as a dowry? These were the romantic questions of the day. Passion might come later, or not at all, unless you think the upper classes had it much better. Oh no, their intimacy was stage 2, just with better architecture. If you were lucky enough to live in a manor or castle, you might get a bed with curtains. Thick, heavy and dusty, but hey, curtains. Nobles had attendants everywhere, even in the bedchamber, so once again alone time was a rare beast. Kings had grooms of the stool, which yes means exactly what it sounds like. And guess what? Even the concept of sleeping together was weirdly communal. Families often slept in shared beds, especially during cold winters. A travelling guest? Into the bed they go. Snuggle up, stranger. You start to see how romantic in this world meant something different. Holding hands might be the riskiest thing you could do all day. Whispers in a dark corridor? Downright scandalous. A single stolen kiss could lead to social ruin, or a forced marriage depending on how many people saw it. And if you're imagining anyone talking openly about their desires, don't. No one had the vocabulary for that. Pleasure was a theological puzzle. Even married couples were expected to moderate their urges. The church called it conjugal duty, and it wasn't supposed to be fun. Too much enthusiasm in the bedroom was considered suspicious. Who are you? A lustful heretic. So you, our unfortunate time traveller, are now stuck in a world where passion has to tiptoe around tradition, surveillance, and a surprisingly judgmental goat. Everything smells like wet hay. Your mattress squeaks in a threatening way. You can't light a candle because it's rationed for prayer. You're cold, and your spouse is wearing a wool tunic that has never known the concept of soft. Tonight's lesson? In medieval Europe, the bedchamber was just another place to survive. Not thrive, survival first, romance optional. But hey, at least the rats aren't biting tonight. Historical fact. Most medieval peasants lived in one-room homes where the entire family shared the space, sometimes even a single bed. Quirky fact. It was common for inns to rent out shared beds to travellers, so you'd often end up sleeping next to a stranger. Cosy. Debated fact. Scholars argue whether lower-class medieval couples truly lacked affection, or whether the sources simply failed to record it due to literacy gaps and cultural norms. So now that you've settled into your one-room dirt palace, complete with creaky straw bedding, let's talk about the next big hurdle in your medieval love life. Privacy. Or, more specifically, the absolute and total lack of it. You wake up before dawn, curled like a question mark under a rough wool blanket, your knees bumping against your sibling, your spouse snoring beside you, and your toddler drooling into your collarbone. Somewhere nearby, the pig shifts in its sleep and lets out a slow, mournful grunt. Romance, you ask? You'd sooner find a unicorn outside mucking the yard. See, the medieval household wasn't just a space for sleeping, it was an all-purpose survival cube. It was the kitchen, the nursery, the birthing room, the deathbed, and yes, the bedroom. Only there weren't any rooms in the modern sense, just open space and vibes. Everyone slept, ate, and laboured together in the same dusty box. If you were lucky, or relatively well off, you might have a sleeping loft above the main room. If you were really lucky, you'd get a wooden partition. Otherwise, it was a free-for-all. Want to sneak in a little affection after a long day of threshing barley and dodging rats? Good luck. Your kids are staring. Your neighbours can hear through the wattle and daub walls, and there's a distinct chance your mother-in-law is awake and praying 6 feet away. Every breath you take feels like a communal act. And yet, life went on. Couples found ways. They became experts in quiet gestures. A hand on the back while stirring the pot. A glance across the field. Even those muffled giggles after dark. Half embarrassment, half rebellion. It wasn't romance the way we imagine it, but it was still something human carved out of chaos. Now picture the flip side of this coin. The great hall of a castle. You've somehow upgraded your medieval experience, and now you're living among the minor nobility. Congratulations. You have marginally fewer fleas and significantly more drafty stone. At night, the castle's great hall transforms into a bedroom, lined with sleeping servants, squires, and various hangers-on sprawled out like a Renaissance slumber party. Privacy here? Still not great. The lord and lady of the house might have a chamber above the hall, accessed by a narrow spiral staircase. Inside, there's a massive wooden bed with thick curtains and a feather mattress that smells faintly of goose and desperation. The curtains give an illusion of privacy, but again, you've got maids, handmaids, and squires popping in and out constantly. Even your nighttime activities might be supervised. For real. Witnesses were sometimes required on the wedding night to ensure the marriage was consummated, especially in noble unions where inheritance was on the line. Imagine trying to get frisky with your father-in-law loitering outside the curtain. Romantic, right? But let's drop back down to your cosy village and talk logistics. Most peasants couldn't afford actual beds. The wealthier ones might own a frame strung with ropes to support a straw or feather mattress, hence the phrase sleep tight, since you had to regularly tighten the ropes. Poorer folks made do with a pile of straw on the floor, maybe wrapped in linen or old cloth to keep the bugs out. Spoiler? It didn't work, you got bugs anyway. And these weren't quaint little straw mats. They were living ecosystems, dust mites, fleas, and the occasional beetle claiming squatters' rights. If you were really unlucky, you had to share with lice. Bathing wasn't frequent, as we'll discuss later, and sheets weren't washed weekly. So, you do the math. Still, none of this stopped people from getting together. After all, life was short. If you made it to age 30 without dying from childbirth, infection, or bad fish, you were practically a legend. And in a world full of hunger, illness, and back-breaking labour, a moment of connection, however messy or awkward, was something to cling to. But of course, even a whiff of passion came with a long list of rules, most of them issued by the one organisation that basically micromanaged everyone's intimate life, the church. We'll get there in the next section. But here's a preview. The church had opinions, strong ones, about when, how, and with whom you were allowed to get physical. And spoiler alert, almost every fun idea was a sin. So imagine lying there in the dark, staring at the cracked wooden beams above your head, your spouse beside you, children curled up at your feet, and the pig still sighing in the corner like it's also tired of this entire arrangement. You'd think you were safe to at least think about something spicy, but even your thoughts could land you in spiritual hot water. And that brings us to an important medieval reality. People didn't separate body and soul the way we do now. Your thoughts, your dreams, your impulses, those were considered direct reflections of your moral worth. So if you had the wrong thought, even in the privacy of your own bed, you were already halfway to damnation. So the people of this time, they were constantly watching themselves, judging themselves, silencing little pieces of who they were just to survive under the weight of it all. That's what makes those rare moments of connection so remarkable. Even with all the pressure, people still found a way to flirt, to love, to hold someone close in a freezing, filthy hut and feel, however briefly, like they weren't alone in the world. Historical fact: medieval peasant homes were typically one-room structures where the entire family, and sometimes animals, slept together, often sharing a single bed or pile of straw. Quirky fact: in some regions it was common for multiple travellers to rent space in the same bed at inns, leading to awkward and very literal bedfellows. Debated fact: some historians argue that peasant families had more intimacy and emotional connection than elite families due to shared hardship and simpler living. Others believe the constant exposure to one another may have stifled emotional closeness. You wake up the next morning stiff, itchy, and profoundly aware that the straw mattress wasn't built for romance. Or for backs, really. Someone's elbow is in your ribcage. The goat is loudly demanding breakfast. And the air inside your charming medieval hut smells like boiled turnips and other people's breath. Welcome to another day in the world, where S3X is governed less by desire and more by doctrine. Because here, the real power in your love life isn't held by you, your partner, or even your mother-in-law who's still judging you silently from across the room. It's the church. And not in the gentle, spiritual way you might imagine. We're talking full-blown regulation, surveillance of the soul kind of power. The medieval church didn't just care about your public behaviour. It wanted a say in your private moments too. Behind closed doors? Doesn't matter. Under the blankets, in the dark, God's watching. And so are the priests, metaphorically, and sometimes literally. By the 12th century, church leaders had developed a sprawling, wildly detailed catalogue of what was acceptable in the bedroom, and what was absolutely not. You didn't just get married. You entered a sacred contract, sealed with procreative duty. That's right. Intimacy wasn't about love or pleasure. It was about making babies. Specifically, Christian babies. Anything else was, at best, a distraction, and at worst, a ticket straight to hell. So let's talk rules. First, there were the acceptable days. Want to be intimate on a Sunday? Forbidden. Holy days? Also forbidden. Lent? That's a 40-day abstinence marathon. Advent? Nope. Fridays? Definitely not. Basically, if you put every church-restricted day on a calendar, you'd be left with about 5 or 6 legal nights per year to enjoy each other without risking eternal damnation. But even on those few greenlit nights, you weren't off the hook. The church had strong opinions about how things should go down. The only sanctioned position, missionary. Any other arrangement was labelled unnatural, a term that had less to do with biology and more to do with theology. Oral S3X, a sin. Rear entry, sin. Standing up, sin. Plus it just sounded dangerous on those uneven floorboards. And it wasn't just the how, it was also the why. If you were doing it for fun, that was sinful. If it involved lust, even inside marriage, that was sinful. If you experienced pleasure and focused too much on it, sin. Basically, if you enjoyed yourself even a little too much, it meant your soul needed a scrub. That's where confession came in. You'd kneel before your parish priest and admit in whispered shame that you had maybe, sort of, liked it, or thought about doing it in a different way, and the priest, likely a man who had sworn off all physical affection for life, would assign you penance, prayers, fasts, maybe a pilgrimage, all because you wanted to enjoy your spouse's company in a way that felt, well, human. Of course, the upper echelons of the church didn't exactly practice what they preached. Popes fathered children, bishops kept mistresses, some monks wrote spicy poetry, but for the average person, especially women, the the rules were a very real burden. Women in particular were seen as temptresses, walking triggers for sin. There was this widespread belief, carried over from early Christian thinkers like Augustine and reinforced by medieval scholars, that women were the root of lust. Their bodies were dangerous, their appetites untrustworthy. A man might sin, but the woman. She caused it. Classic. So married women were told to be passive, obedient and available, but never eager. Desire was not part of the job description. In fact, some church leaders argued that a woman who seemed too enthusiastic in bed might be a witch or possessed. You can't win. You're a sinner if you like it. A sinner if you don't. A sinner if you sneeze in the wrong direction on a feast day. And yes, there were exceptions. Monastic communities sometimes took a more relaxed approach behind closed doors. Some secular priests looked the other way. There were even rogue texts floating around, anonymous handbooks that gave surprisingly detailed advice on marital affection, all couched in flowery Latin just vague enough to dodge censorship. But officially, the church's stance was firm, unforgiving, and backed by centuries of fear-mongering. This culture of shame bled into every part of medieval life. People began to fear not just God's wrath, but their own thoughts. Dreams were suspect. Impure fantasies were seen as spiritual contamination. And because confession required absolute honesty, even your subconscious became a battleground. So what do you do with all that fear? If you're a peasant, you probably shove it deep down and get back to work. If you're noble, maybe you pray harder or donate land to a monastery in the hopes it'll cancel out that one time you thought about your cousin's handmaid. Either way, it creates a world where intimacy is whispered, hidden, and saturated with guilt. Still, even in the most pious corners of society, people broke the rules. They had affairs. They snuck into each other's beds. They had children out of wedlock, then begged for forgiveness. They created life, not out of doctrine, but out of longing and loneliness and that very human desire to be close to someone, even if the church told them not to want it. Historical fact. The church imposed strict regulations on marital S3X, limiting it to procreation and banning it on numerous religious days, often leaving only a handful of acceptable days per year. Quirky fact. One 13th century text, the Penitential of Burchard of Worms, listed sins in such uncomfortable detail that some historians think it was written partly for comedic effect, or personal confession. Debated fact. Scholars still argue whether the church's restrictions were enforced as strictly as written, or whether most people simply ignored the rules in private and paid lip service in public. It's late evening again, and you're back in the same smoky hut, the same scratchy blanket wrapped around your legs, and once again, yep, the goat is watching. But tonight your real judge isn't the livestock, it's the church, still looming over your shoulder like the world's least fun chaperone. You're exhausted, but before you drift off to sleep, your mind starts to wander. Not in a particularly scandalous way, maybe just a daydream involving that neighbour with the strong arms and suspiciously white teeth. But even that is dangerous territory here, because in medieval Europe, your thoughts could be sinful. Even your dreams weren't safe. Welcome to the world of medieval confession. Imagine walking into your parish church, cold stone walls echoing with every footstep, the scent of old incense and wet wool filling your nose. You kneel before a priest, someone who probably hasn't smiled since Pentecost, and prepare to confess. But it's not just about stealing a turnip or skipping mass. No, you're expected to spill your innermost secrets, impure thoughts, wandering eyes, late-night urges. Basically, you're invited to read aloud from your own psychological diary, and the audience is not kind. This was a system designed to root out sin before it bloomed into action. The church believed that impure thoughts were the seeds of damnation. If you even imagined something lustful, let alone enjoyed it, it was considered spiritual rot. You were told to confess those thoughts, name them in detail, and accept punishment. The idea was that you could cleanse your soul before things got worse, but in reality, it often just made people feel broken for being human. And here's where it gets surreal. The church didn't just rely on vague generalities, it had actual manuals for confessors, known as penitentials. These books read like darkly specific, overly curious questionnaires. Questions like, have you lusted after your neighbour's wife while she drew water? Or, have you committed the sin of lasciviousness while churning butter? Yes, really. Someone had to write that down. and someone else had to ask it out loud, the medieval world didn't exactly have good boundaries, you begin to realise something kind of tragic and weird about this system. On the one hand, it created a society hyper-aware of morality, constantly checking itself, trying to stay on the narrow path. On the other, it produced a constant sense of anxiety, a low-level dread that even your unconscious desires might betray you. Nightmares, dreams, fleeting thoughts, they all counted. You couldn't even escape into sleep without risking spiritual danger. So let's say you wake up from a vivid dream, something inappropriate, something sweaty, and you're startled, flushed, embarrassed. Today we'd call it normal. In medieval Europe, that's a demonic attack. Yes, really. The explanation wasn't that your brain was sorting through hormones and stress. It was that a demon had visited you in the night. There were two major culprits in these nighttime visitations, the incubus and the succubus. These weren't just spooky legends, they were accepted theology. A succubus was a female demon who seduced men in their sleep, drawing energy from them. The incubus, her male counterpart, did the same to women. These creatures were said to sit on the chest of the sleeping, paralysing them while initiating very unholy contact. Ever had sleep paralysis? Medieval, you would wake up and immediately run to confession because you believed you'd just been spiritually assaulted. And here's the twist. This explanation gave people a kind of out. If your dream was really scandalous, or if you woke up with evidence of it, you could blame the demons. It wasn't me, Father. I was visited. And depending on your priest's mood that day, he might believe you. After all, demonology was serious business. Entire sermons were preached about these lusty spirits, and monks wrote entire volumes cataloguing their behaviour, some with suspiciously detailed imagination. But it didn't stop with dreams. Even during waking hours, thoughts had weight. Monks and nuns were trained to monitor their inner life constantly, treating every intrusive image like a spiritual virus. They used fasting, flagellation, and relentless prayer to purge themselves of temptation. Some even went so far as to harm their own bodies, scratching at their skin, sleeping on stone floors, just to remind themselves they were more than flesh. You, dear time traveller, might be a simple farmer or a lowly washerwoman, but you've still absorbed all this messaging. You've grown up hearing that the body is weak, that your thoughts must be pure, that love must be duty and not pleasure. So when you think something you shouldn't, or feel a flutter of desire, you're not just embarrassed. You're terrified, not of social shame, though that's real, but of eternal punishment. This creates a strange kind of double life. Publicly, you're obedient. You go to church, you confess, you nod solemnly at the sermons warning against carnal temptation. But privately, you crave warmth. You look at your partner and want to hold them just because. You wonder what it would be like to love without fear. And maybe, just maybe, you even laugh about it. A whispered joke to a friend. A knowing look passed across the field. Because even in a world trying so hard to control the human heart still finds cracks to slip through. And sometimes, those cracks turn into rebellion. Quiet rebellion, sure, but real. People who openly loved each other, who took pleasure in each other's bodies, who, against the odds, found joy between the sermons and the shame. The church may have ruled the laws of the land and the soul, but it never quite mastered desire. Historical fact. The church developed detailed confession manuals in the Middle Ages that guided priests on what to ask, often including extremely specific sexual sins and thoughts. Quirky fact. Belief in incubi and succubi, demons who visited people in their sleep, was so widespread that nighttime emissions were often blamed on them. Debated fact. Scholars continue to debate whether confession culture genuinely shaped medieval people's inner lives, or whether most people confessed out of obligation while mentally tuning out. It's been a long day of hauling firewood, avoiding plague rats, and trying not to commit theological crimes with your eyeballs. As night falls again in your medieval existence, you start to realise there's another hurdle to romance, one that isn't about sin or shame or even the goat watching you from the corner. It's the smell. Let's not dance around it. Medieval hygiene was not exactly winning awards. You, your spouse, the neighbours, the priest. Everyone smells like a combination of sweat, old wool, smoke, turnips, and the constant faint perfume of animal dung, and that's on a good day. Bathing wasn't non-existent, but it was rare. For peasants, a proper bath might only happen a few times a year, and usually only around major feast days like Easter or Christmas. That's right. Your most romantic opportunity might line up with a one day everyone in town simultaneously decides to scrub their bits. Good luck getting the bathhouse to yourself. And yes, there were bathhouses, at least in towns and cities. They were often communal and co-ed, sometimes luxurious, sometimes seedy. But most villagers didn't have access to that. Instead, they might bathe in the river if the weather was warm, or sit in a tub of cold water dragged in from the well, shivering and muttering prayers. Soap was homemade and harsh. Hair washing was optional. Underwear? If you owned more than one set, you were a fashion icon. So now picture this. You're lying in bed next to your spouse, both of you marinated in the day's labour. You smell like onions and dirt. They smell like sheep and sweat. There's no deodorant, no toothpaste, no minty breath. The air is thick with body odour and guilt. And yet, somehow, people still manage to fall in love, or at least get it over with. In the absence of modern hygiene, people relied on other tricks. Sprigs of herbs tucked into clothes, perfumed pouches worn under the armpits, chewing parsley or cloves to freshen the breath. Did it work? Not really, but it was something. Think of it like the medieval version of breath mints, only crunchy and a little bit cursed. And believe it or not, there were actually people who thought bathing too much was bad for you. Some medieval physicians believed that hot water opened your pores and let diseases in. Others claimed that water could disrupt your body's natural humours, which were already moody enough. So instead of bathing, people dusted themselves with powders, or just changed their shirt. Maybe once a month, if it was a holy day. Still, the wealthier classes had more access to cleanliness. Nobles might bathe in large wooden tubs with scented oils, rose petals, and servants fanning the steam. Picture that scene. Someone lounging naked in a candlelit bath surrounded by wine and vile music. Seems romantic, right? Until you realise the tub is shared, the water reused, and the room still smells faintly of horses. Ah, the glamour. Even monks and nuns, those paragons of piety, were subject to the stink. Monasteries had strict rules about washing. Some allowed full-body baths only a few times per year. Instead, they practiced dry washing, which meant rubbing the skin with cloth and hoping God didn't notice the mildew. And yet, in this world of minimal bathing and maximum odour, love still bloomed. Or maybe bloomed isn't the word. Maybe it fermented. People adapted. They got used to the smells. When everyone stinks, no one stinks, right? That's the logic. Your partner's musk became familiar, even comforting. A sign that they'd come home, that they'd survived another day of labour, famine or war. Intimacy wasn't about being pristine. It was about enduring the grime together. And let's not forget, armpits aside, medieval people wanted to be attractive. There were beauty routines. Hair was oiled and braided. Lips were tinted with crushed berries. Men trimmed their beards into fashionable shapes. People plucked body hair with terrifyingly primitive tweezers. And while the tools weren't great and the mirror was basically a polished piece of metal, the effort was there. You might even receive a little gift from your sweetheart. Some lavender, a carved comb, a tiny bottle of rose water. That was peak romance. If someone gave you something that made you less offensive to the nose, it was true love. But beneath all this was something strangely sweet. In a world where nothing was clean, not even your own thoughts, love was still possible. Not the airy, soft-focus love of fairy tales, but a practical, persistent kind. The kind that says, I'll still lie beside you even if you haven't washed your hair since Pentecost. The kind that pulls straw out of your spouse's beard in the morning and hands them a crust of bread with a smile. Of course, not everyone was tolerant. If you truly reeked, like weaponized odour, you might be called out. Public shaming for extreme body stench wasn't common, but it happened. And in courts, foul odour was sometimes cited in annulments or marital disputes. He is unclean and smells foul, one record reads, like the original Bad Tinder review. So you, our unfortunate time traveller, have to make a choice. Are you going to lean into the funk and accept it as the price of medieval companionship? Or are you going to break out your secret stash of thyme and rosewater and try to class up the place? Either way, don't expect anyone to floss. Historical fact. Many medieval people only bathed fully a few times per year, with religious feast days often serving as the unofficial bath days for the masses. Quirky fact. In medieval Paris, bathhouses were co-ed, and sometimes even functioned as social clubs, complete with snacks, drinks and mild flirting, until the church shut them down for being too fun. Debated fact. While popular belief holds that medieval people were filthy, Some historians argue that medieval hygiene was more nuanced and varied by class, region and climate than commonly assumed. You wake up to the tolling of a distant bell, the kind that sounds like it's trying to remind you of all your sins before breakfast. The village is quiet, a soft fog hugging the ground, and you can hear the shuffle of sandals on packed earth. A monk passes by, eyes lowered, lips moving in prayer, his rough woolen robe swaying like a walking sermon. You stretch, bones popping like kindling, and wonder how anyone around here ever manages to fall in love, or even get mildly interested, when half the eligible population has taken a vow of celibacy. Welcome to the era when not having S3X was considered kind of hot, literally and spiritually. Monks and nuns were the celebrities of chastity. In theory, they'd given up all earthly pleasures to focus solely on God. No riches, no status, and certainly no physical affection. But let's be real, it's the Middle Ages. Nothing ever goes exactly according to the scroll, so you wander through the village toward the monastery. It's surrounded by high stone walls, ivy creeping up like silent gossip, and inside the air is heavy with incense and whispered Latin. The monks here live by the rule of St. Benedict, which among other things requires daily silence, rigid routines and absolutely no frisky business. The goal is to transcend earthly temptation and reach a kind of spiritual purity, basically to ghost your own libido. The same goes for the nunnery down the road, though theirs is arguably even stricter. Nuns were seen as brides of Christ, which sounds poetic until you realise it comes with an actual wedding ceremony, complete with a symbolic veil, ring, and years of solitude. They weren't just avoiding S3X, they were spiritually married to someone who wasn't available for cuddling. But here's the thing, they were still human. Despite the rules, despite the vows, monks and nuns had bodies. And those bodies didn't always cooperate with the whole lifelong celibacy plan. In the dead of night, when prayers are done and the abbey is quiet, even the most devout occasionally dream dreams that make confession awkward the next morning. There are surviving letters, some beautifully written, some less so, that hint at these struggles. A monk writing to a fellow brother confesses to being haunted by the memory of a woman he saw once during a pilgrimage. A nun admits in her private writings to feeling warmth she can't explain when she listens to the novice's voice during morning chants. They never act on it, not outwardly, but you can tell. Something is there, a heartbeat, a whisper of longing in the dark. And then, there are the ones who did act on it. Because let's face it, put a bunch of emotionally repressed people into a secluded compound with little stimulation, and eventually something's going to happen. Monastic records are full of scandals, secret trysts, pregnancies, hasty transfers to other monasteries, and the occasional dramatic expulsion. Some monks fell in love with nuns, some with each other. Human connection, even forbidden, always finds a way. You hear a story from a nearby town, an old rumour passed around the village well, about a nun who snuck out at night to meet a monk in the forest. They left tokens for each other, a sprig of rosemary, a folded scrap of vellum, a smooth stone warmed by hand. It sounds romantic until you remember the punishment. Discovery meant shame, public penance, sometimes exile. But they did it anyway, because even in a world built to crush desire, desire doesn't vanish. It just hides better. And outside the cloistered walls, people actually admired this extreme abstinence. The idea that someone could control their urges so completely was seen as holy, powerful, sexy even. Celibacy was a spiritual flex. It meant you were strong enough to deny your flesh, to rise above the animal instincts everyone else wrestled with. You were closer to God, or at least you smelled better than the average pig farmer. Some saints even became famous for their body-denying dedication. Take St. Wilgefortis, a woman who prayed so hard not to be married off that she grew a beard, became unattractive to suitors, and was eventually crucified. Or St. Catherine of Siena, who wrote passionate letters to Christ and practiced extreme fasting, often going without food for weeks. To medieval minds, this was the height of spiritual love, devotion that bordered on obsession. Of course, some scholars think all this denial led to interesting side effects, intense emotional bonds between monks, mystical visions involving divine union that, let's just say, read like euphemisms. There's a famous description of St. Teresa of Avila having a vision where an angel pierced her heart with a fiery spear. She said it brought an ecstatic pain that left her utterly consumed. Interpret that how you will. You wander past the monastery kitchen, where monks are preparing lentils and bread, their gestures calm, eyes distant. You pass the scriptorium, where others copy texts with delicate care. And for a moment you wonder if this life, so restrained and still, might actually offer peace. There's no chasing, no awkward courtship, no goat staring at you while you fumble with your tunic ties. Just silence, prayer, and the occasional candlelit vision of an angel stabbing you with holy fire. But as the evening bell tolls again, you realise the price. No touch, no whispers in the dark, no accidental brush of fingers while kneading dough, the complete absence of physical love. It's not just lonely, it's inhuman. Still, thousands of people chose this life, some out of faith, others for education, safety or status. And for those who could truly embrace it, it offered a kind of clarity. But for most, it was just another cage, another place where longing was locked up behind walls and silence. Historical fact: monks and nuns were required to live under vows of celibacy, and breaking these vows could lead to severe punishments, including public penance and expulsion from religious life. Quirky fact: some monasteries included elaborate confession boxes designed to prevent monks and nuns from being alone with each other, even for spiritual guidance, just in case someone got too confessional. Debated fact: while church records document monastic scandals, some historians argue these events were sensationalized to promote reforms, meaning the actual frequency of rule-breaking remains uncertain. You've managed to steer clear of the monastery's judgmental quiet, but night has crept back in, uninvited as usual, and you're trying once again to fall asleep on a mattress that feels like it holds a personal grudge. You're tired, your bones ache, the moon's playing hide-and-seek with the clouds outside your wooden shutters, and just as your eyelids start to droop, you feel it. That weird, slow dread. Something's in the room. No, not the goat this time. This is different. Heavier. Invisible, but thick. You can't move. Your chest feels pinned down. Your mind is racing. And then, just on the edge of consciousness, a whisper of breath, not yours, right by your ear. Congratulations. You've just had your first medieval encounter with a night demon. Welcome to one of the most bizarre but deeply believed concepts in medieval S3X folklore. Spiritual assault by supernatural visitors. The incubus and succubus. Yes, we touched on them earlier. But now you're face to face with the medieval logic behind those night terrors you probably thought were just bad dreams and stress. Here, they have names, motives, and most unsettling of all, paperwork. An incubus was the male version of the spirit. He crept into your room at night, seduced or overwhelmed you in your sleep, and left you feeling drained, both emotionally and physically. The succubus, his female counterpart, was said to do the same to men, often blamed for nocturnal emissions, which were seen as far more than embarrassing. They were seen as spiritually dangerous. And we're not just talking fringe folklore here. These creatures were taken seriously by theologians, monks, and even legal scholars. Church records include testimonies of people claiming repeated visitations by such spirits, and some clerics even performed exorcisms to ward them off. It wasn't just a ghost story, it was a spiritual crisis. You stir on your straw mattress trying to shake off the dream, or whatever that was, and suddenly you understand why people were so desperate to find explanations. In a world without psychology, neuroscience, or understanding of REM cycles, sleep paralysis and vivid dreams were terrifying mysteries. And when those dreams involved your body doing things without your consent, or worse, with your secret approval, it was easier to blame a demon than admit you might want something the church told you not to. Even more curiously, these demons weren't just described in vague terms. Oh no. Scholars went full fantasy novel with the details. Incubi were said to be shapeshifters, sometimes handsome strangers, sometimes monstrous beasts. Sometimes they took on the appearance of your spouse or someone you secretly admired. They could fly, sneak through keyholes, and manipulate your senses. Basically, medieval shape-shifting Tinder, but with fewer swipes and more shrieking. Some believed that incubi and succubi were fallen angels driven by lust and rage. Others thought they were a type of demon sent by Satan to corrupt the righteous. And just for extra nightmare fuel, certain theologians believed they weren't just visiting, they were reproducing. One theory held that succubi stole seed from men and handed it off to incubi, who then impregnated human women with demonic offspring. These babies were called cambions, and if you're thinking of Merlin from Arthurian legend, yep, he was supposedly one of them. You sit up in bed, glancing nervously at the corner where shadows pool, and try to remind yourself that it's just superstition. But in the medieval mind, this was real. Real enough to confess. Real enough to be punished for. Real enough that people actually developed spiritual protection rituals to prevent nightly visits. Hanging holy relics over the bed. Chanting prayers before sleep. Sleeping fully clothed. Not that anyone was planning a pajama party anyway. Even tying knots in bed curtains to ward off evil. And here's where it gets even messier. These supernatural explanations often served as covers for deeply uncomfortable truths. For example, a woman who became pregnant out of wedlock might claim an incubus visited her because it was safer than admitting to an affair, or worse, that she'd been assaulted. In a society that punished women harshly for S3Xual transgressions, real or imagined, blaming demons could be a lifeline, but not always. Sometimes the claim itself brought more scrutiny. Were you really visited by a demon? Or were you just a lustful woman looking for attention? Accusations of demonic visitation could even spiral into full-blown witchcraft trials. People were executed not just for consorting with demons, but for inviting them in. She lies still at night, someone might whisper. She walks the woods at dusk. She smiles too much. Boom. Witch. Rope. Fire. End of story. Even men weren't immune. A monk caught in a compromising situation might claim he'd been assaulted in his sleep by a succubus, hoping to dodge punishment. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Either way, the idea that you could be corrupted against your will helped medieval people cope with their own internal contradictions. Desire was sinful. But being the victim of a demon, that was almost noble. This gave birth to a strange loophole in the church's iron grip on sexuality. You couldn't want, you couldn't enjoy. But if a demon made you do it, well, then maybe it wasn't your fault. Maybe you were still salvageable. Maybe you just needed a few more prayers and a cold bath. And that says a lot about the emotional toll of medieval morality. People needed excuses just to feel what they felt. They needed stories, wild, surreal, horrifying stories to explain their own humanity. Because being human wasn't enough. You had to be pure, or pretend to be, or blame the devil when you couldn't keep pretending anymore. So tonight, as you pull the rough wool blanket up to your chin and stare into the dark corners of your one-room shack, you understand why someone would rather believe in a shadowy creature stealing into their bed than admit to being lonely, curious, or simply alive. And you hope, fingers crossed, that tonight the only thing sitting on your chest is the crushing weight of unwashed linen. Historical fact: the incubus and succubus were widely believed during the Middle Ages and even documented in church texts as real spiritual threats requiring exorcism. Quirky fact: the term cambion was used in medieval lore to describe the offspring of a human and a demon. One theory even names Merlin, King Arthur's wizard, as a cambion child. Debated fact: scholars continue to argue whether stories of incubi and succubi were sincere supernatural beliefs or socially accepted metaphors for S3Xual guilt, trauma, or forbidden desire. The sun peeks through the cracks in the wooden shutters, thin rays slicing across the dust in the air like hesitant searchlights. You stretch beneath your scratchy blanket, wincing as straw pokes your shoulder blade, and you swear that mattress has become lumpier overnight. It's a new day, and your lower back is plotting against you. Welcome back to the medieval bedroom, or what counts as one, and today you're finally getting the answer to the question nobody asked out loud but everybody's quietly wondering. What, exactly, were medieval beds like? And why did they involve ropes? Spoiler: it's not because anyone was getting tied up. Sorry to disappoint. So here you are, in a modest but semi-respectable home. Maybe you're a skilled tradesman, or the spouse of a reasonably successful farmer. You don't live in a mud hut anymore, but you're still light years away from a castle. You've graduated from the communal straw pile on the floor to an actual bed frame. Behold your sleeping apparatus. It's wood, bulky, and creaks like it's got secrets. On top of it is a lattice of ropes, woven tightly to support the mattress, which is basically a large cloth sack stuffed with straw, hay, feathers, or, if you're cursed, dried corn husks. Not exactly luxury, but a step up from dirt. The phrase "sleep tight" Yeah, that's not just folksy charm, it comes from this system. Every few nights you had to retighten the ropes under the mattress with a special key or by hand. If the ropes sagged, your mattress drooped like a sad hammock, and suddenly your night turned into a medieval chiropractic emergency. Now, depending on your station, your mattress stuffing varied wildly. Poorer folks had straw, which attracted bugs and got mouldy fast. The middle class might splurge on feathers, but that came with sneezing fits and the occasional poultry-scented sleep. The truly unlucky ended up with seaweed or moss, both of which sound rustic and romantic until they start fermenting, and don't even get started on the sheets. If you had them, they were linen, usually unbleached and hand-washed about as often as a comet passed overhead. Pillows were rare, and for most, resting your head meant crumpling your arm or using a rolled-up tunic that still smelled like yesterday's labour. Quilts, down comforters, forget it. You had one heavy wool blanket and maybe a sheepskin if you were lucky. In winter, you might sleep fully clothed, hat included, with your spouse, your children, and possibly a farm animal or two huddled close for warmth. But here's the wild twist. For all its discomfort, the bed was considered a private, even sacred space. The act of sleeping next to someone, especially a spouse, was a symbol of unity. Beds were passed down through families like heirlooms. Some were carved with religious symbols or family crests. A well-crafted bed frame wasn't just furniture, it was legacy. Also, a flex. In noble households, things got a little more extravagant, but only a little. Wealthy families had four-poster beds with heavy curtains that could be drawn closed. Not for romance, mind you, but for warmth and modesty. Remember, servants were everywhere. Privacy was still mostly a myth. Drawing the curtains was less about intimacy, and more about pretending your lady's maid wasn't folding laundry 3 feet away, while you tried to conceive an heir. These noble beds often had thick mattresses filled with down feathers, imported linens, embroidered canopies, and enough bugs to host their own feudal system. Even castles weren't free from lice and fleas. Nobles just had the privilege of complaining about it with more flair. And while we're on the subject of flair, let's talk about one particularly bizarre but real trend: bed-sharing ceremonies. In some regions, the wedding night didn't happen alone. Nope. The newlyweds were tucked into bed while family, friends, and the local priest watched and blessed the bed. Sometimes they even stuck around to make sure things were, progressing. Imagine your in-laws watching you climb into bed and then clapping politely. Romance is dead. Long live social pressure. In rural communities, this got even weirder. Some traditions included bedding songs, which were exactly what they sound like. Loud, awkward tunes sung by relatives while the couple was forcibly escorted to bed. A mix of encouragement, innuendo, and peer pressure. It was part party, part hazing, and entirely something you'd pretend to forget the next day. But let's say you're not newly married. You've been with your spouse for years. You've got your rhythm, your rituals. Maybe you sleep spoon together for warmth, or maybe one of you insists on claiming the entire blanket every night. Yes, that's timeless. And maybe, once in a while, you try to carve out a little moment of closeness. But even then, your environment doesn't exactly make it easy. The bed ropes creak, the mattress shifts unevenly, the straw rustles like it's gossiping about your performance, and outside your curtain, if you even have one, someone is either coughing, praying, or walking past on their way to use the chamber pot. Still, the bed is yours. It's where you sleep, argue, dream, make up, raise children, and, very occasionally, try to steal a bit of romance from a world that makes it almost impossible. It's uncomfortable, overcrowded, and always slightly damp, but somehow, it's also home. And that's the medieval paradox. Beds weren't about luxury or privacy or pleasure. They were tools, platforms for survival. Yet they held some of the most human moments people had. Shared warmth on a frozen night, whispered stories between spouses, quiet comfort after loss. Sometimes that mattered more than how many bugs you slept with. Historical fact: rope beds were common in medieval Europe, especially among the middle classes, and required regular tightening to stay supportive, hence the origin of sleep tight. Quirky fact: in some wedding traditions, witnesses would escort the couple to bed, sometimes even staying in the room to ensure consummation occurred. That's what you call intimate community oversight. Debated fact: while some sources suggest most peasants slept on the floor, other historians argue that simple wooden bed frames were more common than once believed, especially in northern Europe. The fire in the hearth has burned down to a few glowing embers, and the smell of cooked onions still lingers faintly in the air. You're lying back in your slightly improved rope-supported bed, staring at the wooden beams above your head. Outside, the village is quiet. Not peaceful quiet, more like everyone's asleep because they've been digging trenches and birthing calves all day. Quiet. But not you. Tonight you're wondering what's going on inside the other houses. The big ones, the stone ones, with the guards and the banners and the rooms that actually have doors. Because tonight we're slipping inside a medieval castle. Not for jousts or feasts or epic poetry, but for something far more uncomfortable. The tangled mess of desire, power and consent behind noble bedroom doors. Spoiler, it's not a romance novel. It's more like a workplace drama where HR hasn't been invented yet. Now, if you're imagining lords and ladies sighing beneath silk sheets in candlelit chambers, let's dial that back. Yes, noble bedrooms had more flair. Big beds with curtains, cushions stuffed with swan feathers, maybe even a private servant or two to stoke the fire. But luxury doesn't guarantee privacy, or tenderness, or anything resembling equal footing. Let's start with the basics. Among the nobility, marriage wasn't about love. It was about land, titles, and power. Families negotiated matches like business mergers. You were married off at 15 or 16, possibly to someone twice your age, who might not speak your language but definitely owns a fleet of pigs. Your dowry included not just gold or linens, but sometimes entire villages. So you don't really get to say, "No thanks, I'm waiting for butterflies." And once you were married, intimacy was an obligation. The marriage needed to be consummated for it to be legally valid. If it wasn't, your spouse could argue for an annulment. Noble couples sometimes had to perform their first night under official observation. You don't exactly feel sexy when a priest and two squires are hovering outside the drapes. And heaven help you if nothing happens. Male impotence was a valid reason for annulment. So was not bleeding enough if you were the bride. Which brings us to a whole other horror show, virginity tests. More on those later. But let's focus on power for now. Because if you're a nobleman, you're not just married to your lady. You have dozens, even hundreds of people under your roof. Servants, maids, handmaids, wet nurses, cooks, cupbearers. And if you're a noblewoman, you're under someone's roof, always watched, always managed, almost always vulnerable. Servants, especially women, were often subject to the whims of their employers. A nobleman might coerce a maid into his bed with promises of money, marriage, or just the unspoken threat of losing her position. And while the church technically condemned extramarital S3X, enforcement was wildly inconsistent, especially when the man was rich and the woman was poor. Some of these relationships were consensual, or at least emotionally complex. We have letters and poems written by noblemen to servant lovers, some of them surprisingly tender, but many weren't. And when a noblewoman was the target, by a fellow noble, a guard, or even a priest, her options for recourse were slim to none. Victims who spoke up often faced more punishment than the offenders, shame, expulsion, even public humiliation. And let's not ignore how gendered all this was. Men were expected, encouraged even, to be dominant, to sow their seed, even outside marriage. Some men kept mistresses with their wife's reluctant blessing. Kings did this routinely, often elevating their mistresses' children to positions of power. The women in these scenarios had almost no say. Their bodies were political chess pieces. If you were beautiful and clever, you might secure protection or even influence. If not, well, let's just say history doesn't record your name. Now back to that noble bedroom. Even within marriage, S3X wasn't necessarily mutual. It was a duty, a means to an end. If a woman refused her husband, even for good reason, say, illness or injury, he could petition the church to intervene. Some priests even ordered wives to submit, reminding them it was their marital obligation. It wasn't about connection or desire. It was about function, reproduction, and reputation. So where does love fit in? Occasionally, right there in the cracks. There are rare but moving examples of noble couples who grew to genuinely care for one another. Letters between some married pairs show affection, worry, even longing. But those were the exceptions. Most romantic attention happened outside of marriage, in the form of affairs, some private, some public, some downright scandalous. And even then, noblemen had more leeway. A woman caught cheating risked death. A man caught cheating risked a few angry letters and possibly a dramatic poem. Double standards? Absolutely. But that was the medieval way. Women were vessels of virtue. Men were vessels of, well, whatever they felt like. Which brings us to the servants again, because they saw everything. In castles, you didn't get privacy. Not really. You had a lady's maid who helped you dress, a squire who turned down your bed, a cook who heard every argument from the corridor. Gossip was constant. Your bedroom drama became breakfast conversation in the kitchens. Affairs, failures, screaming matches, it all travelled like wildfire. The castle was a palace of whispers, and yet in the middle of all this chaos and coercion, there were still moments of humanity. A stolen kiss between real lovers, a letter smuggled through a servant's apron, a maid who lied to protect her mistress. These tiny rebellions, silent, brave, were how people carved out some sense of control. Because even with all the rules and power games, the truth is simple. People wanted connection, real connection, and when they couldn't find it within the system, they snuck around it, or broke it. Historical fact. In noble households, consummation was necessary to legally seal a marriage, and failure to do so could result in annulment, often investigated by church authorities. Quirky fact. Some noblemen hosted bedding ceremonies where the newlyweds were escorted to bed by guests, then left with drinks, advice, and the occasional creepy smile. Debated fact. Scholars continue to debate how much agency noblewomen truly had within their marriages, with some arguing they had more influence behind the scenes than records suggest. You're walking now along the edge of a manicured garden, a rare moment of colour and order in a medieval world that mostly smells like smoke and regret. The sun's going down, casting golden light across stone walls and ivy-covered corridors, and you can hear soft lute music drifting through an open window. For a moment, it almost feels romantic. Almost. But don't be fooled. Tonight, we're entering the most frustrating zone of medieval intimacy. The friend zone of history, that's right. Tonight, you're about to experience courtly love, the ultimate lesson in loving from a distance with zero touching, constant pining, and more sighing than a 14-year-old with a crush. Picture this. You're a knight. You've trained for years. You've nearly died in 4 minor wars. You've got a dented suit of armour and a personal vendetta against wooden training dummies. And now, finally, you're being knighted. What's your reward? Land? Riches? A comfy chair? No. Your reward is longing, emotional agony, and writing poetry to a woman you're not allowed to touch. Welcome to the maddening world of courtly love, a concept that took root in the 12th century and tangled its fingers deep into the emotional lives of Europe's nobility. It started in the courts of southern France, where poets, troubadours, and bored aristocrats turned love into a stylized game of rules and suffering. It wasn't about marriage. In fact, it was almost always about loving someone else's wife. Bonus points for how miserable it made you. This wasn't just casual flirting, it was a performance, a ritual. You, the noble admirer, were expected to suffer, to admire your lady from afar, to compose verses about the curve of her cheek, or the colour of her eyes, or the way she definitely doesn't even know you exist. You'd send her poems, perform heroic deeds in her honour, and maybe, if she was feeling especially reckless, she'd give you a token, a ribbon, a glove, a smile. That was basically third base. And what did she do in return? Mostly ignore you, because that was her job. The woman in courtly love was always married, always untouchable. She had the upper hand. Your devotion to her wasn't supposed to end in a romantic tryst. It was supposed to make you a better person, more honourable, more refined. Basically, she was your emotional CrossFit coach. Now, let's say you're that knight, and you've just returned from risking your life in a pointless feud over sheep. You walk into court, still bruised and slightly on fire, and she glances your way. You bow. She nods. That's it. You go home and write 400 lines of emotionally repressed poetry. You're heartbroken. Also, you think this is ideal. Why? Because courtly love was never meant to be fulfilled. It was love as suffering, desire as discipline, emotional edging with a lute soundtrack, and in a society where most marriages were arranged for politics, not pleasure, this kind of safe fantasy was the only way people could feel something without blowing up their social lives. It also let women play with power in subtle ways. A married noblewoman, normally expected to be quiet and obedient, could suddenly command the attention of half the court through flirtation and aloof glances. She became a muse, a goddess, an emotional overlord, and if she was clever, she could string along multiple admirers while still technically remaining chaste. Or not. There are plenty of steamy rumours and whispered letters that suggest courtly love sometimes crossed the line. But officially, it was pure, like maddeningly pure. So where did this idea even come from? Some historians trace it back to the Andalusian poetry of Muslim Spain, with its themes of longing and unattainable beauty. Others say it evolved from ancient Roman ideas of idealised love. But by the time it hit medieval France, it had turned into a full-blown cultural obsession. Troubadours travelled from court to court, performing songs about impossible love, and noblemen started treating their love lives like tournaments, with points, rules, and the occasional fatal duel over a glance. Of course, none of this trickled down to the peasants. If you were a farmer in a village where hay was currency, no one expected you to write sonnets to your neighbour's wife while dying inside. Your romance was more like, I've got a pig, you've got teeth, let's do this. Courtly love was elite entertainment, emotional cosplay for people with too much time and not enough affection in their arranged marriages. And here's where it gets truly ironic. The church, which hated almost all forms of fun, didn't initially hate courtly love. After all, it discouraged physical contact, upheld female virtue, and mostly involved men suffering in silence. But over time, as these pure romances started turning into actual affairs, the church flipped. Suddenly these poets and knights were corrupting morals, and women were being led astray by attention, and, worse, ideas. Cue the sermons. Some of the biggest names in medieval literature grew out of this tradition. Think of Lancelot and Guinevere, the ultimate disaster couple. She's married to King Arthur, but her heart belongs to Sir Lancelot, the very model of tortured masculinity. Their affair leads to the downfall of Camelot, which, according to courtly love logic, makes it kind of a success. Love wasn't supposed to last, it was supposed to destroy you. And if you think this whole system sounds weirdly emo, you're not wrong. These people were medieval sad boys with swords. They wrote poetry about heartbreak, stared dramatically out castle windows, and occasionally threw themselves into battle just to avoid thinking about her for 5 minutes. Think Taylor Swift lyrics, but in Latin and with chainmail. By now you're wondering, did anyone actually enjoy courtly love? Maybe. For some, it was a safe outlet for feelings they couldn't otherwise express. For others, it was a game, a way to flirt without consequences. And for a select few, it may have led to genuine connection. But most of the time, it was just a very elaborate way of saying, I like you, but society and your husband and my honour and 12 layers of chainmail are in the way. So you lean back on the garden bench staring up at the stars and you think about all the knights who wrote odes to women they could never touch, and all the women who received those odes and rolled their eyes. You wonder how many of them actually felt something real, and how many were just bored. Either way, it's clear, in the game of courtly love, nobody wins. But everyone gets really, really good at sighing. Historical fact. Courtly love was a literary and social tradition among the medieval nobility, where romantic affection was expressed through poetry and service. But physical consummation was discouraged or forbidden. Quirky fact. Some knights would pledge loyalty to a noblewoman and carry her token, like a glove or ribbon, into battle, even if she barely knew his name. Debated fact. Scholars still argue whether courtly love reflected real social practices or was mostly an elite literary fantasy with limited connection to everyday life. It's mid-morning, and the sun is already high enough to make your wool tunic feel like a damp oven mitt. You're sitting on a wooden bench outside your home, chewing on a crust of bread that might technically qualify as a weapon. A neighbour walks by with a chicken under one arm and a baby on her hip, and you both nod politely without making eye contact. Because let's face it, everyone knows each other's business in this village, including the business that no one talks about out loud. Which brings us to a deeply awkward but extremely important part of medieval life: birth control, or, more accurately, the frantic, highly experimental, and often extremely herbal efforts to not end up with another baby when you're already sharing your bed with 5 children, a goat, and possibly tuberculosis. In theory, you're supposed to welcome every pregnancy as a divine gift. The Church is very clear on this. Procreation is the only acceptable reason to have S3X, and every child is a blessing from God, no matter how many are sleeping in your fireplace at this point. But in practice, you're exhausted, your last baby still doesn't have shoes, and you're pretty sure your body needs a break before your uterus becomes a historical cautionary tale, so what do? You improvise. And in medieval Europe that means turning to a wild mix of folk knowledge, old wives' tales, early medical texts, and prayers whispered with just a hint of desperation. You can't exactly walk into a pharmacy and grab a discreet box off the shelf. Instead, you head to the village midwife, or the wise woman who lives just beyond the edge of town, the one who always smells like fennel and maybe hexes people a little bit. She knows things, not because she read it in a book, but because her grandmother knew it, and her grandmother before her. She hands you a bundle of dried herbs tied with twine, and tells you to steep them in water and drink the tea on the third night after your last encounter. The herbs might include pennyroyal, rue, or wild carrot, plants with real, if unreliable, contraceptive properties. The side effects, of course, range from mildly unpleasant to hope you enjoy vomiting for 2 days. Then there's the amulet option, where a dried weasel's foot around your neck, or a rooster's beak, or a scrap of parchment inscribed with a specific psalm. Some women tied small charms around their waists, wrists, or even tucked them under their mattresses, hoping the power of divine words, or very confused poultry, would protect them from pregnancy. These methods were more about faith and tradition than science, but when you've run out of options, a magic spell carved into birch bark starts to sound pretty good. And then there were barrier methods. Yes, even back then. Animal intestines were used as crude condoms, dried, oiled, and tied with a little string at the base. Not exactly romantic, but surprisingly effective for the time. Wealthier men might acquire these through brothels or medical suppliers. For peasants, good luck convincing your pig to donate. Withdrawal was also a known technique, though discouraged by both church and society. It was called the sin of Onan, after the biblical story where Onan spilled his seed upon the ground and was smitten by God. As a result, medieval men feared not just guilt, but divine lightning bolts if they tried to avoid conception that way. So yeah, pressure's on. Some medical texts written by men who'd clearly never had a functional relationship suggested that if a woman sneezed vigorously after intercourse, she might expel the seed. Others recommended cold baths, hard jumping, or vigorous exercise. Basically, do a medieval Zumba class and hope for the best. And if you really wanted to go deep into the weird, there were recipes involving mash dance, pigeon droppings, or mixtures of wine and crushed stones. One 13th century manual suggested inserting a pessary soaked in olive oil and wool. Another swore by boiling certain roots in milk and drinking it under the light of a waning moon. Were these effective? Not especially, but they reflect a real truth. Women were doing everything they could to control their fertility in a world that gave them almost no power over their own bodies, which of course didn't sit well with the church. Official doctrine labelled most birth control practices as sinful, either because they interfered with divine will, or because they encouraged pleasure without the pesky consequence of children. There were sermons condemning women who used herbs, and priests who refused to grant absolution unless a woman swore to stop tampering with the womb. And God forbid someone accuse you of practicing sorcery. That little bundle of herbs suddenly becomes witchcraft, and you're being dunked in a river to prove your innocence. But despite all this, people persisted, because survival demanded it, because bodies were exhausted, because children meant mouths to feed, and food was never guaranteed. In the face of all that, risking a little sin for the sake of sanity seemed like a fair trade, and there were even men who got on board, especially the ones who couldn't afford another child any more than their wives could. Quietly, discreetly, they learned the herbs, timed the days, played their part. Not because it was romantic, but because it was real. Because love in the medieval sense wasn't always about roses and poetry. Sometimes it was about doing your part to keep your family alive. You take another bite of your rock-hard bread, feeling the sun on your neck and the weight of history on your shoulders. Behind closed doors, beneath rough blankets, couples were trying to find a way to care for each other, through charm bags, whispered prayers, and the occasional sheep gut condom. It's not glamorous, but it's honest. And sometimes, that's the most intimate thing of all. Historical fact. Medieval women used a variety of herbal remedies and folk practices in attempts to prevent pregnancy, many of which had genuine, if limited, contraceptive effects. Quirky fact. Some medieval contraceptive methods involved wearing amulets containing weasel testicles or pieces of dried frog, believed to ward off conception through magical properties. Debated fact. Scholars disagree on how widespread and effective medieval birth control practices were, with some arguing they were more common and quietly accepted than official church teachings suggest. It's late again. The fire is dying, the coals pulsing red like the last heartbeat of the day, and you're curled up on your straw mattress, trying not to think about the fact that it's your 6th pregnancy in 8 years. Your ankles are swollen, your back aches, and your breath comes in short little puffs that make you feel more like a bellows than a person. Outside, someone's singing softly, probably a lullaby. Inside, your toddler's foot is wedged between your ribs, and your knees are jammed against your spouse's spine. You're exhausted, and it's not even winter yet. In the romantic version of history, pregnancy is this gentle, glowing experience. In medieval Europe, it's a gamble with your life, and if you're pregnant, especially for the umpteenth time, everyone around you is already preparing for the worst. Because for medieval women, giving birth wasn't just a rite of passage, it was an act of survival, a spiritual trial, and often, brutally, a public reckoning. Let's start with the basics: prenatal care. If you think you're going to find a helpful midwife with calming tea and a cosy birthing chair, think again. That's assuming you even know you're pregnant. There's no test, no scan, no morning after Google search. You just miss your monthly bleeding, which might have been irregular anyway thanks to malnutrition, and then you wait and hope and worry. Once your belly starts to grow, your entire social identity shifts. You're suddenly a vessel, both sacred and suspicious. The church tells you that bringing life into the world is holy work, but it also warns that Eve's sin lives in every labour pain you feel. You're blessed, yes, but also paying off the spiritual debt of womankind. Comforting, isn't it? And yet, oddly enough, you might finally get a sliver of attention. For once, people are checking on you. The midwife stops by more often. The older women in the village whisper advice. Some of it's practical, like what herbs to avoid, pennyroyal, rue, anything that might loosen the womb, and what to eat, bread, broth, cheese if you can afford it. But most of it is superstition. Don't look at a fire during a storm. Don't step over a black cat. Don't sew after sunset, or your baby will be born tangled in the cord. And then there are the saints. Oh, the saints! You're told to pray to St. Margaret of Antioch, patron of childbirth, who was swallowed by a dragon and escaped unharmed. An oddly specific metaphor. Some women wear her badge pinned to their shift. Others recite her prayer nightly, hoping that invoking her name will mean one less scream when the time comes. As the months roll by, your body changes. Fast. There's no maternity wear. You let out the seams of your gown or wear your husband's clothes. You walk more slowly, sleep less soundly. And as the big day approaches, you're moved into a special birthing space, usually the main room, though some households have a designated lying-in chamber. The midwife arrives, sometimes with an assistant or two, and your other children are shooed away. A curtain might be hung, prayers are whispered, salt is scattered in the corners of the room to ward off evil spirits. Then the labour begins, and it's long, and painful, and terrifying. There's no anaesthesia, no epidural, no sterile tools or bright lights. You're on a straw-stuffed bed, or squatting on a stool carved by someone who also makes wagon wheels. The midwife uses oil, warm water, cloths. If complications arise, and they often do, there's very little anyone can do. If the baby is breech, the midwife might try to turn it manually. If there's hemorrhaging, she'll use herbal poultices and prayers. If the child is stillborn, you'll be told it's God's will. If you die, same. Infant mortality is high. Maternal mortality is high. Everything is high except survival odds. But let's say you survive. The baby is born, wriggling and furious. You cry, not just from relief, but because crying proves the baby's alive. And in the eyes of the church, that's crucial, because if a baby dies before it takes its first breath or is baptized, its soul is believed to go to limbo. Not heaven, not hell, just endless waiting. So baptism happens quickly, sometimes within hours. If the priest isn't available, the midwife might do it herself in emergency fashion, sprinkling holy water and speaking the sacred words with trembling hands. And you? You begin your lying-in period, 40 days of rest, or as close to rest as a medieval woman can get. In theory, you're supposed to stay in bed, recover, and avoid public spaces. But if you're poor, that's a fantasy. You're back to hauling water in 2 weeks, baby slung over your shoulder like a squirmy loaf of bread. Still, even this dangerous process doesn't escape judgment. If your child dies, People may wonder if you sinned. Were you too lustful? Did you use contraceptive herbs before? Was your soul unclean? Women were often blamed for everything from miscarriages to stillbirths, and midwives were constantly under suspicion of witchcraft. If they used unusual herbs or whispered Latin during a delivery, neighbours might accuse them of consorting with demons. Never mind that these women were keeping other women alive in the most dangerous moment of their lives. And here's the worst part. If you survive one birth, it doesn't mean you're done. It means you're expected to do it again and again, until your body gives out or your husband does. There's no real concept of retirement for medieval women. Your fertility is your fate. Your womb is your resume. You measure your worth in children, and your legacy is left in cradles or in graves. But in the quiet moments when the baby sleeps and no one's asking anything of you, you find space to feel it. Joy. Not always, not for everyone, but sometimes. A small face nestled in the crook of your arm, a tiny hand curled around your finger, the weight of a new life that, despite the odds, is here. And that more than anything is what makes the whole terrifying process so heartbreaking. Because even in a world so cruel and casual with women's lives, they still loved fiercely. They still risked everything over and over for the chance to hold someone new and say, "You made it, we made it." Historical fact: maternal and infant mortality rates in medieval Europe were extremely high, with up to 1 in 3 women dying from complications of childbirth in some regions. Quirky fact: St. Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of childbirth, was believed to protect women in labour due to her miraculous escape from being swallowed by a dragon, an event often symbolically compared to the dangers of labour. Debated fact: scholars continue to argue how widely practised the Church's lying in period truly was among peasant women, with some suggesting it was a luxury more common among the elite. It's late afternoon now, and you're slumped against a sun-warmed wall, chewing absent-mindedly on a strip of dried apple, and wondering if your back is ever going to feel normal again. You've just watched your cousin birth her 3rd child in as many years, the whole village whispering about how it came fast, just like the last one. The midwife said something about the stars being in a favourable position, which sounded vaguely reassuring until you remembered the last time the stars aligned. Someone's hayloft burned down. So, you start thinking about how the body and the heavens were always tangled together in the medieval mind, especially when it came to S3X. Because as strange as it sounds today, in the Middle Ages people genuinely believed that your body, your moods, your fertility and your desires were ruled by forces beyond your control. The stars, the seasons, your bodily humours, and yes, even vegetables. Medieval medicine was a unique blend of science, astrology, herbalism and complete guesswork, with just enough truth mixed in to keep people hopeful. And surprisingly, sometimes it wasn't entirely wrong, just deeply weird. So let's say you go to a medieval doctor, or more likely a barber surgeon or local physician, who once read half a Latin book and now charges chickens for house calls. You're not feeling particularly vital. Maybe your desire's gone missing. Maybe you're too interested all the time. Either way, this is a medical issue. The physician doesn't ask about your emotions or your relationship. No, he pulls out his star charts and asks for your birth date and time, because obviously Venus in retrograde is probably messing with your libido. He checks your pulse, stares into your urine, maybe even tastes it. Yes, that was a real diagnostic method, and declares that your black bile is too high, or your hot and moist humours are out of balance, or your spleen is grumpy. The 4 humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, were believed to control everything. Too much phlegm, you're sluggish and cold. Too much blood, you're probably feeling frisky. Want to reduce desire? Bleed them? Want to increase it? Prescribe wine, meat and vigorous exercise. Yes, doctors prescribed S3X, but only when it served a medical or marital function. If your wife was melancholic, a doctor might recommend intercourse to lift her spirits, provided you did it on the right day, under the right planetary alignment, and ideally after a good purge. But if you were too lusty, time to break out the leeches, or worse, a cold sitz bath with sage and vinegar. That'll kill the mood and your dignity. And it wasn't just doctors getting involved. Monks wrote entire treatises on the effects of food and drink on sexual appetite. Avoid garlic, they said. It inflames the passions. Too much red meat? You'll be overwhelmed with lust. Lentils? Best keep those on hand if you're trying to remain chaste. The medieval pantry doubled as a bedroom prescription pad. Some medical texts even claimed certain foods could seed the womb or harden the member. You might be told to eat boiled leeks to improve fertility, or to rub crushed turnip on your thighs to encourage desire. Let that sink in. Crushed turnip as foreplay. The Middle Ages were a time. For women, the advice could be even more convoluted. If you weren't conceiving, it might be your humours, your diet, or, very conveniently, your fault entirely. Some texts warned women not to think sinful thoughts during intercourse, or the baby would come out marked. Others suggested jumping vigorously after the act to help move things along, which sounds suspiciously like a game of medieval hopscotch. But no one was laughing back then. But maybe the strangest part of all this was that medicine didn't separate the physical from the moral. If your body misbehaved, it wasn't just a health issue. It was a sign your soul needed fixing. Unwanted thoughts, sudden urges, dreams that made you sit bolt upright at 3 a.m. Your blood's too hot, your stars are misaligned, and also, have you confessed recently? The answer was always some combination of herbs, fasting, leeches, and prayer, in that order. Still, for all the bizarre remedies and celestial guesswork, there was real tenderness behind the practice. A young wife who couldn't conceive wasn't just dismissed, she was often treated with sincere concern. A husband who lost interest in his wife might seek help not because he was cruel, but because he genuinely thought something had gone wrong with his humours or his spleen. There was a shared belief that love, even if arranged, deserved to work. That bodies and hearts could be healed, even if the tools looked like salad ingredients and goat entrails. And sometimes, in the candlelit hush of a quiet home, when the herbs had been taken and the stars looked favourable, couples did find connection again. A touch without fear, a moment of softness. Maybe it was the rosemary bath, maybe it was the turnip, maybe it was just two people remembering how to see each other through all the noise and doctrine. As the sun dips behind the village wall, you tuck your legs up, feeling the coolness of the stone against your back, and think about how desperately people wanted to understand themselves, to explain what made them yearn, ache, love. And even if they got it hilariously wrong with their horoscopes and pigeon-based treatments, at least they were trying. In a world that made intimacy a sin and childbirth a gamble, even trying to make it better was an act of courage. Historical fact: medieval physicians believed that the four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, controlled all physical and emotional states, including desire and fertility. Quirky fact: some medieval medical texts recommended rubbing a paste made of crushed turnips, eggs, and herbs onto the thighs or genitals to increase sexual arousal. Results were inconsistent. Debated fact: historians continue to debate how widely accepted astrological and humour-based medicine was outside elite circles, with some evidence suggesting peasants often relied more on folk remedies and midwives than trained physicians. The room is dim, lit only by a single tallow candle sputtering like it's as exhausted as you are. You're in someone else's house tonight, visiting a cousin in a slightly better part of town, where the floors are swept once a week and the lice have the decency to hide during daylight. There's a soft murmur in the other room, women talking in low, serious voices. You're not invited, but you know what they're discussing. The bride. She's young, of course she is. Just old enough to marry, which in this century means somewhere between just started menstruating and already buried one child. Tomorrow is her wedding night, and tonight her aunt and mother are preparing her the only way they know how, with whispered warnings, cryptic advice, and the all-important discussion about blood. Because in medieval Europe, nothing confirmed a woman's virtue more than the presence, or absence, of blood on the wedding sheets. And nothing complicated the world of sexuality, shame, and honour more than the twisted obsession with virginity. Let's talk about what this meant. Really meant. Virginity wasn't just a personal state of being, it was a public commodity, a symbol of purity, family honour, and marriage market value. A bride was expected to be untouched, unspoiled, and uneducated in the mechanics of the bedroom unless, of course, she wasn't. Then she was expected to lie convincingly and hope no one noticed. And proof of virginity, that infamous bloodstain on the sheets, it was everything. After the wedding night, The new couple's bed sheets were sometimes inspected by family members, servants, or even, brace yourself, local officials in certain places and periods. A visible stain was taken as confirmation that the bride had been pure and the marriage had been properly consummated. No blood. Uh-oh. Let the accusations, annulments, and possibly public shaming begin, which, as you might imagine, caused a fair amount of panic. Not all women bleed during first intercourse. Not all first nights go according to plan. Sometimes the act itself is fumbled through layers of fear and confusion. But none of that mattered. The stain was the goal, and when it didn't appear naturally, it sometimes got help. Yes, people faked it. Midwives, sympathetic mothers, and clever brides knew tricks. A cut finger and a well-timed smear, animal blood, carefully dabbed. In one case, a woman was said to have hidden a thin bladder of red wine between her thighs and crushed it at the right moment. Desperate times, desperate measures. On the flip side, there were horrifying virginity tests inflicted on women suspected of dishonesty. Some involved invasive physical exams, others relied on outdated anatomical myths, like the belief that a woman's body made different noises or responded differently after S3X. One popular superstition claimed a woman's urine would behave a certain way in water if she was no longer a virgin. This is what happens when you don't teach science. But beyond the blood and bizarre science, what's most disturbing is the sheer weight of this expectation. A woman's entire worth could hinge on something as fragile and uncontrollable as a thin piece of tissue and one terrifying night. Her family's reputation, her future security, even her safety. One wrong assumption, and she could be labelled impure, unmarriageable, or worse, deliberately deceptive. The church naturally had a lot to say on the matter. Virginity was revered, celebrated, saints were canonised for it. Martyrs went to their deaths rather than surrender it. Women who died before losing it were believed to ascend to heaven untouched, as holy brides of Christ. And for nuns, virginity was a spiritual commitment, one that came with its own set of rituals and vows, treated as sacred and irreversible. But here's where things get even more confusing. The church also taught that within marriage, S3X was not only acceptable, it was necessary. To deny your spouse was a sin. So you had to go from untouched and terrified to obedient and available in a single night. No wonder so many wedding nights ended in tears, confusion, or just a whole lot of uncomfortable silence. And if a woman seemed too knowledgeable, too confident, that was suspect. How did she know what to expect? Had she practiced? Read something she shouldn't? Been spoiled by someone? Even a slightly enthusiastic response could raise eyebrows. Men, meanwhile, were under significantly less pressure. Sure, noblemen were encouraged to be chaste before marriage, but few were. Boys might be sent to brothels as a rite of passage, and any rumours of premarital dalliances were often laughed off. A man who didn't know what he was doing in the bedroom was considered unfortunate. A woman who did, dangerous. Some women tried to reclaim control of this narrative. There were love poems written from a female perspective, rare but powerful, that spoke openly about desire, pleasure, even agency. A few courtly romances featured bold, witty heroines who didn't wait around for permission. But these were the exception, not the rule. Most medieval women lived under the constant threat of being judged for something they couldn't even define, let alone control. And the irony, virginity itself was, and still is, an abstract concept. No universal definition, no definitive marker. Just layers of cultural expectation, religious pressure, and shaky science piled on top of each other like badly stacked firewood. Back in the house, the candle's gone out. The bride is likely lying awake, scared out of her mind. Her new husband may be equally terrified, pretending he's not. Tomorrow there may be blood, or not. There may be celebration, or accusation. But regardless of the outcome, the burden of proof, literally, rests on a sheet. You sigh, pulling your cloak tighter around your shoulders, wondering how many women before her lived through the same fear. How many found comfort in their mother's eyes. How many faked disdain just to stay safe. And how many dared to want more than just survival. Historical fact. In many parts of medieval Europe, a bloodstain on the wedding sheets was expected as proof of a bride's virginity, and its absence could lead to public scandal or annulment. Quirky fact. Some midwives were skilled in faking virginity proof, using animal blood or small bladders filled with wine, crushed at just the right moment. Debated fact. Historians continue to argue how widespread and strictly enforced these virginity rituals were across different regions and classes, with some suggesting they were more symbolic in practice than literal. You're standing in the centre of the village square, dust swirling around your boots, the scent of sheep and wet earth in your nose, and everyone is watching. Not you, thankfully, but the poor soul standing in the stocks with their arms pinned forward and head locked into place, cheeks already red from the sun, and possibly from the humiliation. Someone throws a turnip, a child laughs, and above it all, a priest stands on the church steps reading out the charges in a voice that's half fury, half smug satisfaction. The crime, fornication, public indecency, adultery, take your pick. In medieval Europe, S3X wasn't just private, it was prosecutable. Welcome to the uncomfortably public world of S3Xual shame and punishment, where if you broke the rules, everyone got to know about it. Now, let's set the stage. You're living in a tight-knit community where every choice is noticed, every relationship gossiped about, and every indiscretion catalogued like some kind of judgmental village yearbook. You so much as smile too long at someone else's spouse, and by dusk the rumours are echoing across the fields. It's not that people weren't doing things, they absolutely were, but if you got caught, that's when the real fun began. The church, of course, had a vice grip on the moral code. Every act of intimacy outside of marriage, whether consensual or not, was considered sin, and the lines were rigid. Fornication, S3X between unmarried people, adultery, S3X with someone else's spouse, and lechery, which could mean literally anything vaguely naughty, were all offences. Add to that inappropriate touching, suggestive dancing, or impure thoughts, and you're one bad dream away from a public flogging. Confession could save your soul, but it didn't always save your reputation, especially if your misstep became public knowledge. And while wealthy men might bribe their way out of trouble, most people, especially women, paid a much steeper price. Take the stocks, for instance. Those wooden punishment devices weren't just for thieves and drunks, they were often used for moral crimes, including fornication. The goal wasn't to hurt you physically, it was to humiliate you. You'd be locked up in the centre of town, sometimes for hours, while everyone watched. Some threw rotten food, some just stared. Either way, you were the evening's entertainment. For repeat offenders or more serious crimes, there were harsher options. Public whipping, a shaming parade around town, or forced penance. You might be ordered to stand barefoot at the church door on Sunday morning, dressed in nothing but a shift and ashes on your head, begging for forgiveness in front of your neighbours. Imagine doing your walk of shame while your entire social circle stands there with arms crossed and judgment in their eyes. And then there were the scarlet letters, literally. In some regions, convicted adulterers or fornicators were forced to wear a special badge or distinctive clothing for a set period, marking them as morally suspect. Think of it as the original medieval influencer. You walk into the market and everyone instantly knows your business, whether you want them to or not. Women bore the brunt of this system. A man might be scolded or fined, but a woman. She was often cast as the seductress, the corrupter, the reason he fell. And if a pregnancy resulted from the crime, the man might vanish, but the woman couldn't hide a growing belly. Out-of-wedlock births were a one-way ticket to scandal, and illegitimate children often suffered too, denied inheritance, looked down on, or even abandoned. Unmarried mothers were sometimes punished more harshly than the men who fathered their children. In some towns, they were paraded through the streets in shame. In others, they were denied churching, the ritual that allowed a woman to return to the religious community after childbirth. Without it, she remained symbolically unclean. Try explaining that to your neighbours when they all notice you're still sitting in the back pew 3 months later. There was even a category of crime known as incontinence, which sounds medical but was really just a polite way of saying you couldn't keep it in your pants. Priests tracked these offences meticulously, particularly during Lent and Advent when even married couples were supposed to abstain. If you slipped up during one of these holy seasons, double sin, bonus shame. Yet paradoxically, the punishment was sometimes uneven. Nobles caught in S3Xual scandal could occasionally smooth things over with land, gold, or a quick trip to the nearest monastery for a performative sabbatical. But peasants, townspeople, and especially servants had fewer options. Their misdeeds became town gossip, their reputations shredded beyond repair. Even if the act was consensual, even if it was love, even if no one got hurt, public morality took precedence over private truth. And if the relationship in question crossed social boundaries, say a noble and a servant, or a priest and a parishioner, the consequences could be explosive. The lower status partner usually paid the price. The noble might face a fine or a stern talking to. The servant could lose their position, be banished, or worse. But people still took the risk. Lovers still met in the shadows, whispered at the well, passed letters through door cracks. They did it because they were human, because desire doesn't wait for permission slips, and because sometimes, even under threat of public ridicule, people just want to be seen, touched, and loved. And when they got caught, they paid. Not just with fines or time in the stocks, but with years of suspicion. A reputation ruined in one night might take a lifetime to rebuild, and often it never did. Back in the square, the person in the stocks has gone quiet. The crowd's starting to disperse. Someone mutters a prayer. Someone else kicks dust over the turnip mess. And you're left thinking how strange it is. How deeply invested medieval society was in everyone's private business. How morality became performance. And how punishment was less about justice and more about keeping people scared. Historical fact. Public punishment for S3X offences, such as fornication and adultery, was common in medieval towns, often involving stocks, public confession, or penance rituals performed in front of the whole community. Quirky fact. In parts of England and France, women caught committing adultery were sometimes forced to parade through the streets in their undergarments, or with symbolic items, like shears or ropes, meant to represent their supposed misdeeds. Debated fact. Historians debate how uniformly these punishments were applied, with evidence suggesting that local customs, class and gender heavily influenced who was punished, and how severely. It's a rainy evening now, the kind where water leaks through the thatched roof and trickles down the walls like the house itself is crying. You're tucked into your usual corner, wrapped in a damp cloak, the fire stubbornly refusing to light. Thunder rolls somewhere off in the hills, and you tell yourself that sound outside was just a branch snapping, not footsteps. But a chill lingers anyway, not from the cold, but from a topic most villagers only dare to whisper about after dark: sodomy. In medieval Europe, few accusations carried more danger, more weight, or more confusion than this one. And to make things murkier, sodomy didn't just mean what it means today. It was a catch-all term for everything the church considered sexually unnatural. Basically anything outside of procreative, marital, missionary position intimacy. Which, as we've seen, already had more rules than a monastery kitchen. And right at the top of that forbidden list, S3X relationships. Now that's not to say S3X attraction didn't exist in the Middle Ages. It absolutely did. It existed quietly, cautiously, sometimes secretly, sometimes defiantly, and always in a world that refused to admit it had a name. Because in this time and place there was no common, acceptable vocabulary for what we'd now call homosexuality. There was no space in public discourse to say, "This is who I am," only, "This is a sin I must never confess." That didn't stop people from loving each other, from longing, from touching. But it did mean they had to do it with the weight of constant fear pressing down on their chests like the damp air tonight. Let's start with the laws. In much of medieval Europe, sodomy was a capital offence. That's right, punishable by death. In some regions, a first offence might mean fines, penance, or exile. A second, torture. A third, execution. The methods varied: burning, hanging, drowning, but the message was consistent. Don't get caught. Ever. Of course, getting caught wasn't always about hard evidence. Rumours were enough. A whisper in the wrong ear, a jealous rival, a priest with a grudge. It could all spiral into an accusation. And once someone was accused of sodomy, especially in cities like Florence or Avignon, their chances of escaping punishment depended less on innocence and more on connections. Wealthy men might bribe their way out of charges. Poor men? Not so lucky. And what counted as sodomy? That's where it gets confusing and sinister. The church lumped together acts that had nothing to do with orientation. Oral S3X between a married couple, sodomy, rear entry between man and woman, sodomy, any act that didn't lead directly to procreation, sodomy. So you can imagine how easily S3X intimacy became the ultimate taboo in this theological tangle. But beneath all the sermons and statutes, people still found each other. Letters survive, carefully worded, full of longing. Poems written by monks to fellow brothers, filled with tender imagery of shared wine, quiet nights, and hands brushing in cloisters. In the royal courts, there are whispers of noblemen who favoured their male attendants, gifting them land and titles with suspicious generosity. Some of these relationships were romantic, some weren't, but all were watched with suspicion. There's the famous example of Richard the Lionheart, King of England and Crusader extraordinaire, whose close relationship with King Philip II of France raised many eyebrows. They dined together, slept in the same bed, not uncommon for nobles, and exchanged letters that read less like political correspondence and more like emotional diaries. Was it romantic? Historians argue, but even the whiff of possibility has kept scholars busy for centuries. Same-sex relationships between women, meanwhile, were even less understood and less documented. The Church, perhaps unable to imagine that women could do that sort of thing without a man involved, mostly ignored it or treated it as a lesser sin. That didn't make life safer, though. Women accused of same-sex acts could still face severe punishment, especially if they were seen as transgressing gender roles, wearing men's clothing, taking leadership roles, or refusing marriage. Some rare cases are chilling. In 14th century France, 2 women were arrested for living together as man and wife. One of them wore men's clothes and assumed the role of husband. When discovered, both were tried. One was banished, the other was burned at the stake. And yet, even in this environment of fear, affection survived. There are stories, fleeting, fragmented, of lifelong friendships that were probably something more, of coded love letters, of secret rendezvous in woods or churchyards, of monastic companionships that lasted decades. The Church called them special friendships and tried to discourage them, but the emotional reality of them is clear. They weren't all sinful, some were simply human. Inside monasteries and convents, things got especially complicated. Celibacy didn't eliminate desire, it often just hid it under layers of guilt and ritual. Some monks formed intense, emotionally charged bonds. Nuns too shared long nights, close beds, whispered prayers. Some records describe these attachments as unhealthy. Others suggest they were tolerated as long as they didn't disrupt the order. Again, love found its cracks. There's also the strange middle ground, the spiritual union. Same-sex friends who exchanged vows, called each other beloved, and were even buried together. Were these platonic soulmates or covert couples? It's impossible to say. The lines blur, and that's the heartbreak of this era. You can read the lines, but never the hearts behind them. And always looming over it all was shame. The idea that something as natural as love could be twisted into a crime, a sin, a threat. That's the legacy of medieval sodomy laws. Not just the punishment, but the silence, the hiding, the centuries of loneliness baked into stone walls and chapel ceilings. Tonight, as rain taps softly on the roof and the wind presses at the shutters, you think about the people who spent their whole lives loving in secret, who wrote poems no one read, who risked everything for a moment of closeness, and you wonder what the world might have looked like if they hadn't had to hide. Historical fact. In much of medieval Europe, sodomy, broadly defined by the Church, was a serious criminal offence, often punishable by death, with laws harshly enforced in cities like Florence and Venice. Quirky fact. Some monasteries recorded instances of special friendships between monks, deep emotional bonds that church leaders sometimes discouraged, but often could not prevent. Debated fact. Historians still debate whether famous medieval figures like Richard the Lionheart had same S3X relationships, or whether these accounts reflect close but non-romantic bonds, interpreted through modern lenses. The door creaks open just as the sun dips below the horizon, and the air from inside hits you like a wall of hot, herbal-scented steam. It smells like sweat, rosemary, cheap wine, and something faintly metallic. A few heads turn your way, curious, amused, disinterested. Welcome to a medieval brothel, where sin is on the menu, business is booming, and the Church is watching very, very closely. Let's get one thing straight. Prostitution wasn't exactly legal in medieval Europe, but it also wasn't entirely illegal. It occupied a strange, paradoxical place in the social order, officially condemned as sinful and morally corrupt, yet widely tolerated, taxed, and in some cases, municipally organised. Because in a society where almost everything about S3X was wrapped in sin and shame, someone had to do the dirty work. And that someone, more often than not, was a woman working behind a red-curtained doorway for the city council. Yep, some towns had state-run brothels. No joke. You could walk through certain districts in Paris, London or Nuremberg and find signs indicating the presence of a sanctioned house of ill repute. These brothels were carefully regulated with rules on everything from pricing to clothing. The idea was that allowing regulated prostitution would protect respectable women, reduce S3X crimes, and prevent clerics from misbehaving quite so obviously, in theory. The Church's stance on all this was complicated. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas famously said prostitution was a necessary evil, like a sewer in a palace. Better to have filth flow somewhere than have it back up into the halls of power, translation. Let men sin in one place so they don't sin everywhere. Surprisingly practical, if slightly nauseating. So while priests preached about chastity, city councils were issuing licenses. In some cases, brothels even had official madams appointed by the local authorities. These women were often former prostitutes themselves, tasked with managing the workers, collecting taxes and ensuring no one got too rowdy. Think medieval HR with more candles and fewer boundaries, but let's not romanticize it. The reality for the women working inside these brothels was rarely glamorous. Many were there out of desperation. Widows, abandoned wives, orphaned girls, or women who'd fallen through the thin cracks of society. Some had chosen the work, some had not. And the work was hard, relentless, and often dangerous. Brothels operated under strict rules. In some cities, prostitutes had to wear designated clothing, often yellow veils or striped cloaks, so they could be identified in public. They were barred from walking in certain areas, attending church on Sundays, or even entering bakeries at peak hours. Everything about their lives was controlled, visible, and shamed, even though their services were in high demand. Customers ranged from lonely peasants to travelling merchants to clergy sneaking in under cover of darkness. And yes, the church punished priests for visiting brothels, but enforcement was inconsistent. Some brothels had secret entrances for respectable men who didn't want to be seen. Others offered confession packages, a visit followed by a quick trip next door to a priest who'd cleanse your soul, for a fee. And the health situation? A total disaster. Medieval medicine didn't understand STIs, but it definitely noticed when people started breaking out in pustules or suffering painful urination. These symptoms were often blamed on excess heat or bad air. Treatments ranged from herbal compresses to cauterization. You do not want to know what that looked like. Just know it involved hot irons and a deeply flawed understanding of anatomy. Even so, brothels thrived. Some cities had entire districts dedicated to pleasure. Streets lined with taverns, gambling dens, musicians and workers, leaning out windows making offers with winks and whistles. There was music, laughter, danger, and a kind of raw honesty. In a world where S3X was hidden behind layers of guilt and silence, here it was shouted from windows. But these places weren't just about S3X, they were social hubs. Travellers came for company as much as for physical relief. Deals were struck over wine-stained tables, secrets were whispered in beds. In a world where everyone was constantly being watched, by neighbours, by the church, by your own terrified conscience, brothels offered a strange kind of freedom, at least for a night. Of course, not everyone was happy with this arrangement. Moral reformers railed against the brothels. Local leaders flipped between tolerating and cracking down. Periods of tolerance were often followed by waves of moral panic, during which brothels were shut down, workers expelled, and anyone wearing a yellow scarf in public risked being pelted with garbage. And during outbreaks of disease, especially the Black Death, prostitutes were often scapegoated. People blamed them for spreading plague, as if S3X workers had a secret pact with rats. Some were driven out of towns entirely, forced into wandering or hiding. A few reinvented themselves as mystics or holy women, living in remote hermitages where they could escape judgment. Most weren't so lucky. But despite the pressure, brothels persisted. They adapted. They became part of the unspoken social machinery that made medieval cities function. Even as the church condemned them, nobles visited them. Even as reformers tried to erase them, new ones opened. And while women bore the brunt of the stigma, they also found ways, however fragile, to survive, to support each other, and to carve out small spaces of control in a world that gave them so little. You sit now on a stone step just down the street, watching shadows shift as the night deepens. Laughter drifts from a nearby doorway, followed by the quiet strum of a lute and a woman's voice singing something soft and low. It's not romantic, it's not tragic, it just is. A slice of medieval life that refuses to fit neatly into anyone's moral expectations. And you think, for all the preaching, for all the shame, the fire and brimstone and fear, people still reached for each other, for touch, for connection, for a moment when no one was watching and nothing was forbidden. Historical fact. Many medieval European cities operated or tolerated state-regulated brothels, where prostitutes were taxed and subject to rules about clothing, behaviour and client conduct. Quirky fact. Some city-run brothels included built-in confession booths, allowing clients to repent immediately after their visit, effectively offering a sin now, atone later service. Debated fact. Scholars continue to debate whether the regulation of brothels provided protection and structure for women, or simply institutionalised their exploitation under a veneer of order. It's just before dawn, the sky a pale smear of grey-blue, and you're walking along the edge of a crumbling town wall, your breath fogging slightly in the chilly air. You're not supposed to be out this early. It's a time for thieves and bakers, not idle wanderers. But something's been nagging at you. A story you overheard at the tavern last night. A tale told with a smirk and a wink, about a girl locked up not by her parents, not by the church, but by her underwear. You heard the phrase, chastity belt. So here you are, standing by the blacksmith shop where the fire's just been rekindled and iron tools glint in the half-light, and you're wondering, did people really do that? Did they actually put women in metal cages to control their bodies? Was that a thing, or just a dirty joke that got way out of hand? Let's break it down. The chastity belt, as popular imagination would have it, is a contraption of metal and leather, shaped like medieval underwear from hell. It allegedly locked over a woman's pelvis, with openings just big enough to allow the bare minimum of hygiene and absolutely nothing else. In theory, it prevented intercourse. In practice, well, that's where things get murky. For centuries, people believed chastity belts were real, used by jealous husbands or overprotective fathers to keep women pure while they were away. Knights supposedly locked up their wives before heading off to the Crusades, handing the key to a trusted squire and riding off into the holy sunset, leaving their lady trapped in a high-security undercarriage. Sounds like the perfect medieval punchline, doesn't it? Just the right mix of absurdity, cruelty and control to make it believable. But here's the twist. There's very little evidence they were actually used in the Middle Ages. The earliest references to chastity belts come not from serious legal texts or church decrees, but from satire, poems, plays, and bawdy jokes. Writers like Boccaccio and Chaucer mention belts of chastity not as real tools, but as symbols of possessiveness and mistrust. In short, it was already a punchline in their day, a metaphor for the absurd lengths men might go to control women's bodies. So where do all the museum pieces come from? You know the ones, those terrifying iron contraptions on display in torture museums across Europe. The ones that look like they were designed by a sadistic locksmith with a grudge. Most of them fakes, or at least misattributed. Modern scholars now believe many of the so-called medieval chastity belts in museums were actually created in the 18th and 19th centuries, during a time when people were obsessed with the wild and barbaric Middle Ages. The Victorian era in particular loved inventing moral horror stories about the past to make themselves feel more civilized by comparison. Nothing says progress like judging imaginary ancient prudes for locking up their daughters' genitals. But while full metal belts probably weren't standard issue in medieval Europe, that doesn't mean the idea of enforced chastity wasn't real. Control over women's sexuality was a deeply ingrained social and religious goal. Physical confinement, isolation, public shaming, and threats of violence were all used to keep women in line. A symbolic belt wasn't necessary when a culture was already doing the work, and in some cases crude belts or harnesses may have been used, not for long-term wear, but for punishment, humiliation, or medical purposes. A woman deemed promiscuous might be forced into one as a form of correction. There are records, vague and rare, of such devices being used in insane asylums during later centuries, intended not to preserve virginity, but to discourage masturbation, which is not better. Also, let's not forget, metallurgy in the Middle Ages wasn't exactly delicate. The idea of someone wearing an iron belt 24/7, without injury or infection, is laughable when you realise most people got blisters from their own shoes. No antibiotics, no proper cleaning, no stretch fabrics, just rust, friction, and a whole lot of inflammation. So how did this myth stick around for so long? Because it's so tempting. The chastity belt feeds into all our modern stereotypes about the Middle Ages, that it was repressive, patriarchal, painfully literal. It gives us a visual for what was often an invisible system of control, and it plays into every over-the-top Renaissance fair horror story we secretly love. Plus, let's be honest, it's a little kinky. The very idea of a chastity belt has been reabsorbed into modern pop culture as something titillating, taboo, fetishized. It's gone from alleged historical reality to steampunk accessory. What was once a cautionary tale about male control is now a Halloween costume with fake keys and rhinestones. Progress. Still, there's something deeply medieval about the idea of the chastity belt, even if the object itself was more myth than fact. It's not the iron and leather that mattered. It was the message. That a woman's virtue was a possession. That it could be guarded, locked, owned and proven. That her body was a thing to protect from others, or from herself. And the tragic irony? Women often internalized this. They were taught to fear their own desires, to measure their worth by what they hadn't done, to view their bodies as sacred battlegrounds where purity could be lost in a single misstep. You didn't need a lock and key when shame could do the job better. Now, as the sun finally rises over the rooftops and the smith hammers at a horseshoe with rhythmic clinks, you realise that medieval Europe didn't need iron underwear to control people. It had guilt, it had religion, it had social surveillance and endless fear of public disgrace. The chastity belt might not have been real in the way we imagine, but the reason we imagine it absolutely was. Historical fact. Despite popular belief, there is little credible evidence that chastity belts were widely used in medieval Europe. Most known examples were created centuries later, likely for display or as satire. Quirky fact. Some 19th century chastity belts were made and sold as anti-masturbation devices during periods of intense sexual moral panic, ironically helping cement the false belief in their medieval origins. Debated fact. Scholars disagree on whether any form of chastity belt was ever actually used during the Middle Ages, with some arguing they may have been real, but extremely rare and primarily symbolic or punitive. It's midday, and the sky is choked with grey clouds heavy enough to feel biblical. In the distance, bells toll, not the cheerful wedding kind, but the slow, grim peal that says someone's in trouble. You follow the sound through muddy streets lined with faces peeking from shutters, and children holding onto aprons with wide, wary eyes. At the centre of the square, just beyond the market stalls, there's a wooden platform going up fast, ropes pulled taut, barrels overturned and kindling laid like a warning. This isn't an execution yet. Not officially. But everyone knows what's coming. The word's already spread. Another witch. And of course, she was too beautiful. Tonight we're diving into one of the ugliest intersections of sex, power and fear in medieval Europe, the witch hunts, and the twisted suspicion of lustful or simply independent women. Because while witch trials didn't hit their fever pitch until the Renaissance and beyond, their roots were very much medieval, and tangled up with everything society feared about female desire, control, and the unknowable mystery of the human body. First, let's set the tone. For much of the Middle Ages, the Church didn't officially believe in witches the way we think of them now. There were no broomsticks, no covens, no bubbling cauldrons. Early church leaders saw folk magic as superstition, not satanic evil. If someone claimed to be flying through the night or dancing with demons, they were assumed to be delusional, not dangerous. Still sinful, mind you, but not yet the stuff of firewood and ropes. But over time, the idea of the witch began to evolve, slowly, then violently. By the 13th century, thanks in part to fear of heresy and a growing obsession with purity, the image of the witch morphed into something darker. She was no longer a misguided village healer or a gossipy midwife. She was now something else, a sexual threat, a seductress, a woman whose body was a weapon, wielded knowingly and sinfully against innocent Christian men. And this shift wasn't just casual, it was institutional. Theologians began writing about witches as not only spiritually dangerous, but physically dangerous. They tempted men. They had carnal congress with demons. Incubi, of course, and used their allure to destroy marriages, steal fertility, and bring down entire communities. Some treatises even claimed that witches stole men's genitals and kept them in birds' nests. No, really. That's in the Malleus Maleficarum, an actual witch-hunting manual from the 15th century, written with the energy of someone who definitely got rejected a lot. So what made a woman suspect? Let's start with the obvious. Beauty. Too beautiful. Clearly unnatural. That smooth skin and perfect hair must be thanks to a pact with the devil. Or maybe you were just attractive to the wrong man, one with a jealous wife or an angry priest nearby. Suddenly your face becomes evidence. Your very existence becomes a threat. But it wasn't just looks. It was behaviour. Too outspoken, too educated, too sexually autonomous, suspicious. A widow living alone and managing her own affairs. Dangerous. A healer who used herbs and didn't defer to the local priest. Possibly summoning Satan. Even being childless could get you accused, because if you weren't using your body for its intended purpose, you must be using it for something wicked. Midwives were especially vulnerable. These women had intimate knowledge of female anatomy, childbirth, and herbal remedies, often passed down through generations. They were essential to the community, but also deeply feared. After all, they controlled life and death at the threshold. If a baby was stillborn or a mother bled out during labour, someone needed to be blamed, and the midwife, standing there with bloody hands and a satchel of suspicious plants, was an easy target. And of course, if you were sexually confident, or even just rumoured to be, you were walking a thin, burning line. Medieval society couldn't handle a woman who wanted pleasure, who chose her lovers, who declined a proposal, who dared to flirt without shame. These weren't just social offences, they were red flags for witchcraft. A lustful woman was a woman out of control, and that terrified everyone. When accusations happened, the process was brutal. You didn't need hard evidence, just gossip, fear, and the right amount of bad luck. Once accused, your chances of avoiding torture and public humiliation were slim. You might be stripped and examined for the devil's mark, a mole, a scar, a birthmark that could be interpreted as a sign of a pact with Satan. You'd be interrogated, sometimes for days, asked about demons, sabbats, familiars, and your supposed ability to kill crops with a glance. And if you confessed, often under duress or torture, it didn't end there. You were marched through the streets, jeered at, spat on. Maybe you were hanged, maybe burned, maybe drowned in a trial by water, where if you sank you were innocent, but also dead, and if you floated you were guilty, and about to be executed. A real lose-lose situation. Yet despite the horror, the accused women weren't always powerless. Some fought back with dignity, some cursed their captors with chilling calm, others refused to confess, even under unimaginable pressure. Their strength, in the face of absurd cruelty, lingers in the record like a whisper, one that says, "You can punish me, but you don't understand me." Because what they really represented, these witches, was resistance. Not rebellion with pitchforks and fire, but the quieter kind. Control over their bodies, their knowledge, their choices. That scared people more than any hex ever could. And maybe that's why the witch, even centuries later, continues to fascinate us. She's been turned into a symbol of power, of defiance, of feminine mystery. But in the medieval world, she was a woman just like any other, caught in the crosshairs of fear, faith, and the desperate need to explain why things go wrong. As you walk away from the square, the crowd dispersing behind you and the firewood stacked a little too neatly, you think about how thin the line really was. One rumour, one lover, one glance too long, and suddenly you're no longer someone's daughter or neighbour or healer. You're other. And that label? It could burn. Historical fact. Though most witch trials peaked after the medieval period, their roots began in the late Middle Ages, when fears of heresy, female sexuality and folk medicine began to merge into suspicion of witchcraft. Quirky fact. The Malleus Maleficarum, a 15th century witch-hunting guide, claimed witches could steal men's genitals and hide them in nests, a belief that combined misogyny, bad biology, and worse storytelling. Debated fact. While some historians argue that early witch trials targeted mostly midwives and healers, others suggest that victims came from a wide range of social backgrounds and that accusations often stemmed more from personal vendettas than actual practices. You're standing in a narrow cloister garden. The stone path damp with dew and lined by herbs that smell vaguely medicinal. Lavender, thyme, maybe some sage. The morning bells have just finished ringing, echoing through the arches like a call that no one can ignore. In the distance, a group of nuns move quietly between the vegetable plots and the chapel door, their habits swishing softly with each step. One of them glances your way and smiles, not coyly, not flirtatiously, but with the quiet confidence of someone who has found peace, and possibly buried more than one juicy secret beneath that serene exterior. Because let's talk about monastic sexuality, and not the pious, serene monk-on-a-hill version. No, we're digging into what life actually looked like behind the cloister walls, where vows of chastity and real human desires existed in the same cramped dormitories. Spoiler alert, things were complicated. First, the rules. If you joined a monastery or convent, you took a vow of chastity, not just a promise to avoid S3X, but a whole renunciation of romantic or physical intimacy. Your body no longer belonged to you, it belonged to God. Your desires were to be purified, controlled, or, preferably, banished entirely through prayer, fasting, and the occasional cold bath. In theory. But in practice, you're still human. You still have hormones. You still remember what someone's hand felt like against yours before you donned the habit. And you still have to sleep in the same room with a dozen other people, all of you trying to pretend you're not aware of each other's breathing patterns. Let's start with the monks. In male monasteries, the official stance was total abstinence, but enforcement was uneven. Some monks genuinely tried to live lives of spiritual discipline, waking before dawn, scrubbing floors, copying manuscripts by candlelight. Others? Let's just say a few too many late-night prayers turned into whispered meetings behind the sacristy door. There are records, written complaints, internal disciplinary letters, even reports to bishops, about monks engaging in S3X with each other, with local women, and occasionally with visitors seeking spiritual counsel. Some monasteries even had repeat offenders, nicknamed for their habits, the other kind, and gently relocated rather than expelled outright. Because expelling someone for lust meant admitting the monastery had a problem, and no abbot wanted that stain on their record. It wasn't just the men either. Convents were just as full of tension, though the documentation is murkier, partly because women's writing was less preserved, and partly because people were slower to believe that women could even experience desire without a man's involvement. Spoiler, they could. Letters between nuns, what few survive, are full of intense emotional language. Phrases like, "My soul's companion, beloved of my heart, your absence is a wound I cannot heal." These were not just spiritual bonds. In some cases, scholars believe they were romantic, possibly physical, or maybe just so deeply intimate that the line between love and friendship blurred, as it often does in places where connection is both forbidden and desperately needed. And then there's the Church's absolute terror over dreams. That's right. Monks and nuns were taught that even erotic dreams could be a sign of spiritual weakness. Some manuals advised cold baths before bed. Others suggested sleeping in uncomfortable positions or even flogging oneself to drive out impure thoughts. The Regula Benedicti, one of the foundational monastic rulebooks, stressed humility and control of the body, but it never quite accounted for the subconscious sneaking around at 3 a.m. When a monk or nun was caught in a compromising situation, the response varied. If it was a one-time slip, the punishment might be public confession, additional fasting, or temporary isolation. Repeat offenders, however, could be transferred, demoted, or very rarely expelled, but most institutions preferred to keep things quiet. Better to pray it away than stir up scandal. Now, to be clear, not everyone was breaking their vows. Many monks and nuns lived deeply devout, celibate lives, finding fulfillment in prayer, study, service, and their spiritual communities. But the point is, desire didn't vanish behind the cloister walls. It just got wrapped in guilt and ritual and denial. It became part of the daily spiritual battle, something to wrestle with, confess, and, if all else failed, blame on the devil. And sometimes it wasn't just about lust, it was about control. A monk might be accused of impropriety by someone looking to disgrace him. A nun's closeness with another woman might be twisted into a scandal to remove her from power. Accusations were currency, especially in wealthy religious houses where politics, property, and family influence all came into play. Some convents, especially those full of noble women, operated almost like small courts. There were hierarchies, alliances, rivalries, and yes, sometimes flirtations. There are even tales, half-documented, half-whispered, of nuns sneaking out at night, of forbidden lovers climbing walls, of secret letters passed through kitchen staff. One famous story tells of a nun who faked visions for years just to get alone time, and who ended up becoming an unofficial spiritual leader because of how convincing her ecstasies were. The church called it heresy. The community called it inspiration. And yet, for all the conflict, these were also spaces of profound intimacy. In a world where most women were married off young and given little room for independence, the convent offered something different. Female community, education, purpose. For many it was a place of refuge, a life chosen freely. And within that space, yes, there was closeness. Yes, there was sometimes love. The kind of love that couldn't be spoken aloud, but didn't have to be, because it was written into the way someone arranged your veil, or left extra food at your door, or stayed by your bed when you were sick. Back in the garden, the nuns have disappeared into the chapel. The herbs sway gently in the breeze, and the silence feels sacred. Not because it's empty, but because it's full of everything left unsaid. You realise that behind these walls, behind the layers of linen and silence, there are stories that were never written down, glances never recorded, affections never punished because they were never spoken aloud. And maybe that's the most medieval thing of all, the tension between desire and duty, always coiled tight beneath the surface. Historical fact: monastic communities were expected to follow strict rules of celibacy, but historical records include instances of monks and nuns engaging in romantic or S3X relationships despite their vows. Quirky fact: some monastic manuals advised monks to sleep in uncomfortable positions or wear coarse undergarments to discourage erotic dreams, effectively inventing the anti-sexy pyjama. Debated fact: while there's evidence of same S3X emotional and possibly romantic relationships within convents and monasteries, scholars still debate the nature and frequency of physical intimacy among monastics. You're riding on the back of a creaky cart today, surrounded by sacks of grain and a disgruntled chicken who keeps giving you the side eye. The road ahead is long, winding through hills dusted with late summer green, and beside you sits a merchant, middle-aged, grizzled, clearly the type who has seen every corner of this continent and lived to tell the most inappropriate versions of it. As the wheels jolt over another rock, he leans closer and starts in with a wink. You ever hear about the court of love? And just like that, you're off into another strange, ridiculous and very French chapter of medieval life. Courtly love, where passion was polished into poetry, rules were invented to regulate longing, and lust dressed up in silk and spoke in rhymed couplets. Let's begin with the basics. Courtly love was a literary and cultural phenomenon that began in the 12th century, mostly in southern France, with the troubadours and their lute-strumming devotion to noble women who were almost always unavailable, unattainable, or very much married. These poets wrote verses of longing, service, despair, and secret ecstasy, claiming that true love could never be fully realised, because of course, once fulfilled, it would lose its magic. Yes, it was the ultimate slow burn, and in many ways the original will-they-won't-they trope. But here's the twist. Courtly love wasn't just about poetry. It shaped real social behaviour among the nobility. Entire courts of love were allegedly held, gatherings where noble women would debate questions of love and romance like medieval Judge Judy's. Picture a group of finely dressed ladies sipping wine in a candlelit hall, while arguing whether a knight who glanced at another woman during a joust could still be considered faithful. Ridiculous? Completely. Entertaining? Absolutely. At the centre of this tradition was the lady, elevated to near divine status. She was the object of adoration, the muse, the judge, and the keeper of the hero's suffering. A proper knight was expected to serve her, bringing her gifts, defending her honour, composing sonnets about the way her eyes looked in moonlight, even if he'd only seen her once through a window while she was eating soup. But let's not pretend this was feminism. The lady might have had power within the love game, but it was always constrained. She was an idea more than a person, idealised, abstract, rarely given a voice of her own, and while the knight suffered poetically from afar, she was often stuck in a political marriage with a dull nobleman whose only love language was land acquisition. And that brings us to the greatest irony of courtly love. It was built around adultery. The lady was usually married, the knight unattached. Their love by design was forbidden. That's what made it exciting. Yet, because this was medieval Europe, they often didn't act on it, at least not in the literature. The ideal was emotional suffering, not physical satisfaction. It was all about yearning, longing, loving from a distance while writing extremely dramatic verses under trees. In theory, in practice, you bet there were affairs. Not everyone was content to write haikus about ankles. Some lords and ladies absolutely took things further, behind tapestries, in castle gardens, or while pretending to read psalms. Courtly love became both a poetic tradition and a kind of cultural permission slip for upper-class flirtation. As long as you cloaked it in metaphor and chivalry, you could get away with quite a bit. And let's be honest, everyone loved the drama. These romantic games added sparkle to the otherwise dull reality of political marriages. A noble woman might not be able to choose her husband, but she could choose her poet. A knight might be bound to serve his liege, but he could still pine publicly for the countess who gave him a token at the last tournament. Love, in this context, was a performance, a role everyone played, but not everyone was impressed. The church, for one, side-eyed courtly love with deep suspicion. All that glorified adultery and emotional indulgence, sinful, dangerous, distracting from one's duties to God and family. Monks wrote tracts denouncing the troubadours, calling their songs honey-coated poison. Some theologians even warned that romantic longing could open the soul to demonic influence, especially if it led to writing bad poetry. Probably. And the peasants? They were too busy trying not to die of exposure or hunger to worry about whether Lady Isabeau was favouring Sir Geoffrey over Sir Bernard this spring. Courtly love was a game of the elite, something to be admired, perhaps imitated in song but rarely replicated in daily life. Still, its influence trickled down. Ballads, love songs, and dramatic tales of doomed romance spread across the continent. Even in the smallest villages, minstrels told stories of brave knights and cruel mistresses, of kisses stolen in candlelight, of heartbreak and loyalty, and rose petals on cold stone floors. And this tradition didn't die with the Middle Ages. It laid the foundation for the romantic ideals we still wrestle with today. The idea that love must be painful to be real, that longing is purer than satisfaction, that the best relationships are the most tragic ones. We've traded lutes for playlists and sonnets for texts, but the emotional choreography hasn't changed all that much. Back in the cart, the merchant is still talking. He's recounting a scandal in the Duchess's court, a lady caught passing love notes in the chapel. Apparently it was quite the scene. The bishop had a fit, the knight got exiled, and the lady had to pretend the poems were about her dog. Everyone knew better, of course, but that's the magic of courtly love. Plausible deniability, wrapped in rhymes and wrapped tighter in layers of silk and status. You bump along the road, the sky starting to break into sunlight now, and you wonder how many loves were lost to politeness, to propriety, to poems that never quite said what they meant. How many hearts sat quietly at banquets, stealing glances and pretending to care about who brought the biggest goose to dinner? Because in the end, courtly love was less about having, and more about wanting. And wanting, in medieval Europe, was often the closest thing people had to freedom. Historical fact. The tradition of courtly love emerged in the 12th century among the nobility of southern France, promoting romantic ideals that often revolved around longing, secrecy, and emotional devotion to a usually unattainable noblewoman. Quirky fact. Some noble courts allegedly held courts of love, where women judged imaginary or real romantic disputes, offering verdicts on questions like whether love could survive jealousy, or if it was more noble to suffer in silence than to declare affection. Debated fact. Scholars disagree on how much courtly love actually influenced behaviour versus literature, with some viewing it as mostly a poetic construct, and others seeing it as a real social code among the upper classes. The road narrows as you reach the outskirts of town, where fences give way to open fields and the buildings sit farther apart, quieter, like they're keeping secrets. There's one house you notice immediately, not because it's grand or elaborate, but because it stands alone. A little stone cottage with a sagging roof and ivy creeping up the sides, half swallowed by time. No children's laughter, no smoke from the chimney, just silence. And from the way the villagers glance at it without looking, you know, this is a widow's house. Tonight we're stepping into the strange liminal world of widows, recluses, and women who lived outside the sexual expectations of medieval society. because not every woman was a bride, not every woman had a husband or wanted one, and not every love story ended with a wedding feast and a shared bed. In medieval Europe, being unmarried wasn't just a personal detail, it was a problem. Women were expected to marry early and remain under male authority their entire lives. Father, husband, then son. The moment a woman existed outside that structure, she became difficult to categorize. And when society can't categorize someone, it starts to fear them. Take widows, for instance. On the surface, they were objects of pity. Oh, poor Margaret, alone after her husband passed in the harvest. But dig a little deeper, and you'll see something far more complex. Widows could own property, they could run businesses. They weren't expected to be virginal, but they also weren't expected to be sexually active. They were strange hybrids, once as three dual beings, now floating somewhere between shame and power. Some widows remarried, of course, especially younger ones, but many didn't. And for those who remained single, intentionally or otherwise, life was a balancing act. Too friendly with a neighbour, rumours, too fashionable, suspicion, too reclusive, definitely up to something. And yet, some women chose widowhood as freedom. In a world where being unmarried as a young woman was dangerous and being a wife could be constraining, widowhood was oddly liberating. It gave women legal standing they rarely had before. They could make contracts, appear in court, inherit land, and in some places even vote in local guilds. For a brief period in a woman's life she could become a person, not just someone's daughter or wife. Then there were anchoresses, women who took things even further by stepping entirely out of society. These weren't just recluses. Anchoresses willingly enclosed themselves in tiny cells, often attached to churches, to live lives of spiritual devotion. They gave up not just physical pleasure, but physical existence in the communal world. Some were sealed into their rooms with a ceremony similar to a funeral, the door bricked up behind them except for a narrow slit to receive food and confession. And you'd think, why would anyone choose this? The truth is, for some women, it was the only path to autonomy. Within those walls, they were untouchable, outside the expectations of marriage, untouched by scandal, answerable only to God. Some became spiritual celebrities, offering counsel to pilgrims, writing letters, even influencing politics, through a narrow window no less. Julian of Norwich, one of the most famous anchoresses, wrote profound theological reflections in the 14th century that still echo today. And while she lived in physical confinement, her spiritual influence stretched across Europe. Not a bad legacy for someone society expected to sit quietly and age out of relevance. Then there were the women who simply never married, maybe by choice, maybe by fate. The spinsters, the old maids, the quietly independent women who lived alone or with sisters, often working as weavers, herbalists, or midwives. Some were respected, some tolerated, some feared. All existed outside the comfortable lines society tried so hard to draw, and guess what? These women had desires too. Just because they weren't wives didn't mean they were saints. Love didn't stop at a gravestone or shrink away in a hermit's cell. We have stories, some whispered, some written, of widows who took lovers, of recluses who wrote passionate spiritual meditations that sound suspiciously like emotional devotion to someone very earthly. One woman, Marjorie Kempe, dictated a spiritual autobiography that included intense mystical experiences, some of which were so sensually described it made male scribes uncomfortable. Her visions of Christ were filled with longing, intimacy, even pleasure. Was it pure religious ecstasy? Was it the only language she had to describe a deeper emotional need? Scholars still argue, but either way it speaks volumes about how blurred the lines between spiritual and sensual could become, especially when the usual outlets for desire were closed. And for those widows and unmarried women who did take lovers, discretion was everything. A well-placed rumour could unravel a woman's safety, especially if she had property someone else wanted. One accusation of moral looseness, and suddenly her land was contested, her position undermined, her social standing shattered. And yet they still took the risk. Because sometimes, even when the world says your body is no longer useful, you remember that it's still yours. Some towns even had specific roles or designations for widows. In cities like Venice and Florence, wealthy widows could fund charities, endow chapels, and even sponsor artists or scholars. They were active participants in civic life, especially when they kept their status by not remarrying. Because marriage, for all its social approval, often meant giving up autonomy. Once married again, a woman's property typically transferred to her new husband. Staying single wasn't just emotional, it was economic strategy. But even in the best-case scenarios, being outside the sexual norms came with risk. An unmarried woman with means was often assumed to be either a secret libertine or a witch. A quiet widow was accused of being too withdrawn. An outspoken one, too bold. There was no right way to be free because freedom itself was the problem. And so many lived in that space, between expectation and judgment, between desire and solitude. Some leaned into religious life. Others found comfort in female friendships that may or may not have become something deeper. Many simply endured, finding joy where they could, love when it was safe, and dignity even when the world tried to take it. As you pass the little house again, you notice a figure at the window, just a flash of silver hair and a face that looks calm, unreadable. Maybe she was married once, maybe not. Maybe she loved wildly, maybe she still does. You'll never know, and that's the point. These women kept their stories quiet, not because they were ashamed, but because the world didn't deserve the full truth. Historical fact: widows in medieval Europe often had more legal rights and autonomy than married women, allowing them to own property, manage businesses, and make contracts independently. Quirky fact: Anchoresses, religious women who chose to live in enclosed cells, were sometimes sealed into walls next to churches, where they lived for decades in solitude while offering spiritual counsel to the community. Debated fact: scholars continue to explore how common and socially accepted it was for unmarried or widowed women to pursue romantic or sexual relationships outside of marriage, given the risks of public scandal. The sun is high now, blazing over a crooked signpost that points in 5 different directions, and somehow still manages to be no help at all. You've been walking most of the day, your feet dusty, your stomach grumbling faintly, and your pouch slightly lighter than you'd like. But ahead, just past a bend in the road, a group of people is gathered. Pilgrims by the look of them. Dusty cloaks, scallop shells sewn onto sleeves, staffs in hand, and eyes full of equal parts exhaustion and anticipation. And just like that, you realise what's happening. You've stumbled into a medieval pilgrimage, a holy journey that, for some, was less about the destination and more about who you might accidentally flirt with on the way. Because let's be honest, in medieval Europe, a pilgrimage was one of the few socially acceptable reasons to pack a bag, leave your village, and meet people you weren't related to by blood, marriage, or the breadline at church. It was a spiritual journey, yes, but it was also a rare opportunity for freedom, movement, and yes, occasionally romantic distraction. Now don't get the wrong idea. Pilgrimage was serious business. People walked hundreds of miles to reach sacred destinations: Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England, Rome, Jerusalem, even local shrines with a reputation for miracles. Some went to fulfill vows, others to seek healing, penance, or divine forgiveness. The roads were dangerous, the food was bad, and the accommodations were even worse. But it was still better than staying home, especially if home meant judgmental neighbours and spiritual claustrophobia. And here's where things get interesting. The church might have framed pilgrimage as a solemn act of penance, but once people hit the road, things loosened up. Social hierarchies blurred. That widow in the fine linen might be walking beside a shoemaker's apprentice. A knight might carry a noblewoman's pack. A monk might accidentally, or not so accidentally, strike up a very animated conversation with a washerwoman over the best route through Burgundy. You slept in barns. You shared bread with strangers. You walked together for days, long enough for conversation to turn personal, for eyes to linger a little longer, for tired jokes to turn into whispered secrets by firelight. Pilgrimage didn't just take you out of your village, it took you out of your role. You were no longer just someone's daughter, husband, servant, or tenant. You were a pilgrim, and in that liminal space, new identities and new relationships could begin to form. Not that this was all some medieval dating app. Plenty of people kept things devout and drama-free. But there's ample evidence, both in official records and literary accounts, that pilgrimage could become socially complicated. The Canterbury Tales, for instance, by Chaucer, paints a vivid picture of a motley group of pilgrims who bring their entire personalities and baggage along for the ride, including flirtations, insults, scandalous stories, and more than one uncomfortable romantic subplot. In real life, there were pilgrims who met future spouses on the road. Others used the journey as an excuse for a romantic escape. Some nobles arranged pilgrimages for young daughters, not so much for their souls, but for the hope they'd meet a suitable match en route. And in some darker cases, pilgrimage was used as punishment for sexual misconduct. Go do 300 miles with a rock in your shoe and think about what you've done. Church authorities, of course, weren't thrilled with the romantic side quests. They frequently issued warnings against improper behaviour on the road. Inns near pilgrimage routes were watched closely for signs of immorality, and don't even get started on the concerns about mixed-sex travel. There were complaints of young people walking together too familiarly, as one bishop once put it. Translation: stop holding hands or I swear I'll call the Inquisition. But let's talk about the relics for a moment. Every good pilgrimage involved a destination with a relic. Bones, blood, hair, or the vaguely labelled dust of a saint. Some shrines had dozens of pilgrims lining up to touch, kiss, or gaze upon these sacred objects, believing they could cure illness, absolve sin, or even boost fertility. Which brings us to another point. A lot of people went on pilgrimage hoping for help with sexual problems. Impotence, infertility, lust, even excessive desire. All fair game. So you had pilgrims kneeling before holy relics praying, "Please let me conceive, please cure my urges, or please make my husband interested again." It was spiritual desperation wrapped in deeply personal longing, which of course only added more emotional weight to the journey and made temporary companionship on the road that much more appealing. And then there were the stories of pilgrim fraud. People who weren't actually devout but used the open road for more questionable pursuits. Some posed as pilgrims to beg for food or money. Others joined groups just to take advantage of the hospitality offered along the route. And some, well, they were just looking for a little anonymous adventure far from home. One English woman in the 14th century was documented for repeatedly joining pilgrim groups, charming her way into the confidence of other travellers, and vanishing with their money and valuables. Another story, less confirmed but frequently retold, tells of a man who went on pilgrimage with his cousin and returned with a child. His wife was not amused. You can almost picture it. A dusty road, a makeshift campfire, someone pulling out a lute, badly, and two people sitting just a little too close as the stars come out. Maybe they talk about miracles, maybe they don't, maybe it's just comfort on a long lonely road, and maybe that moment becomes something more. Because in a world that kept people locked tightly into their roles, a pilgrimage was one of the few times you could reimagine your life. Reinvent yourself, even if only for a few weeks. You could be someone new to someone who didn't already know your whole story. And sometimes, that was more healing than any saint's bones could offer. As the group in front of you continues down the road, you hear a woman laugh, bright, carefree, the kind of laugh that doesn't belong in a confessional. A young man glances her way and stumbles a little, clearly not watching his step. They catch each other's eyes, and for a moment in all that dust and devotion, you see something that looks suspiciously like flirting. Historical fact. Pilgrimage was a common religious practice in medieval Europe, often involving long journeys to sacred sites, and while deeply spiritual for many, it also served as a rare social space where people of different classes could interact. Quirky fact. Some people were sentenced to go on pilgrimage as a form of punishment for crimes, including sexual misconduct, effectively making it the world's least relaxing religious vacation. Debated fact. Scholars debate how widespread romantic and sexual activity was among pilgrims, with some viewing it as isolated incidents, and others suggesting that the road's liminality made such behaviour fairly common. You're resting now in the shadow of a weathered oak tree, its branches thick and sprawling like arms stretched in a yawn. The sun's dipping lower, turning everything gold. Your hands, your tunic, the parchment tucked under your arm. You're not alone here. Across the glade, a young man sits cross-legged, quill in hand, eyes full of the kind of dramatic sorrow you only find in people who haven't yet lived through a real heartbreak. He sighs, then sighs again, louder, just in case you missed the first one. And with that, we enter the final act of our little romance tour, the love letters and moody poets of late medieval Europe. Because by the late 14th and 15th centuries something subtle had shifted in the air. People had always felt love, of course, and written about it too. But now there was a growing hunger to express it, not just in the safe, sanitized metaphors of courtly love, but in messier, more personal ways. Suddenly, emotions weren't just whispered in dark corridors or buried under Latin prayer. They were scratched into parchment, folded into letters, passed under doors, or hidden in the pages of borrowed prayer books. Let's talk about the medieval love letter, equal parts art form and emotional gamble. If you were literate, not a given, and had access to writing tools, also not a given, you might find yourself putting ink to parchment to express the thing that kept you awake at night. Maybe it was the laundress who always touched your hand a second longer than necessary, or the knight with the smirk who once brought you a token from the tournament, or maybe it was your betrothed, whom you hadn't seen in months because travel took forever, and messenger pigeons were not standard issue. The letters themselves were often florid to the point of theatrical. People borrowed phrases from religious texts, poetry, and older romances. A typical opening might go something like, "To the fairest flower ever to bloom under heaven's eye, whose absence pierces me more deeply than a knight's sword." Calm down, Geoffrey, it's not that serious. But also, it is. Sometimes love letters were written by intermediaries, scribes or trusted friends, especially if the writer wasn't confident with words. And yes, sometimes they were dictated in secret, with the recipient none the wiser about the ghostwriter in the background. Romance by committee, the medieval version of having your friend text your crush for you. And these letters weren't always heterosexual. While most surviving examples are from men to women, or vice versa, in conventional arrangements, we do have hints and traces of letters that don't fit neatly into those boxes. A monk writing to another monk, a woman addressing another in unusually tender language, always couched carefully in friendship, always open to interpretation, but undeniably full of feeling. Of course, sending a love letter came with risks. If it fell into the wrong hands, your father's, your betrothed's, your parish priest's, you could find yourself in serious trouble. Marriages could be broken off, reputations ruined. Letters were sometimes used in legal cases as evidence of adultery or dishonour. One careless fold, and your private devotion became very public scandal. And yet, people wrote them anyway, because sometimes the heart overruled the brain. Sometimes you had something to say that you couldn't keep inside, even if it cost you everything. And sometimes, just sometimes, the letter worked. The reply came, a rendezvous followed, a romance, hidden or even blessed, began. But love letters weren't the only outlet for emotional expression. Poetry had its own renaissance during this time, fueled by the spread of vernacular languages. Instead of writing in Latin, more and more poets were composing in French, Italian, English, German, languages people actually spoke. And with this shift came a new wave of deeply personal, often melodramatic verse. Enter the emo boys of the Middle Ages. Yes, you know them. Pale, pining, always comparing their unrequited love to a fatal wound. One of the most famous was Petrarch, whose sonnets to Laura, a woman he may or may not have ever even spoken to, basically invented the modern sad boy aesthetic. She was perfect. She was untouchable. She didn't love him back. He wrote about her anyway, for years, even after she died. It's like medieval Tumblr with fewer cat gifs. And then there were the troubadours still hanging on in southern France, but with a more intimate tone. Less about abstract ideals, more about specific women and very specific grievances. She smiled at me once in 1382, and now my soul is hers forever, basically. If they'd had eyeliner, they would have used it. Women wrote poetry too, though fewer of their works survive. But when they do, they're often deeply insightful. Less performative, more grounded. They wrote about longing, sure, but also betrayal, loneliness, anger. They wrote about what it meant to be desired but not listened to, loved but not respected. It was raw, often sad, and always real. And sometimes the poetry wasn't about romance at all, but about desire in its broadest sense, the hunger to be seen, touched, understood. In a world where physical intimacy was monitored, judged, and restricted, poetry became a kind of secret room, a place where the body could be mentioned, remembered, maybe even reclaimed. Of course, this emotional outpouring made church officials uneasy. Too much passion, even in verse, was suspect, especially if it distracted from God. Monks were warned against reading worldly love poems. Confessors were instructed to watch for excessive romantic imagination, and in some cases love letters and poems were actually burned, literally destroyed to save someone's soul. But you can't burn the feeling itself. You can't stop people from writing down what they're too scared to say out loud, and you certainly can't stop a lovesick teenager from comparing his heartbreak to a knight bleeding out on a battlefield. Some traditions are eternal. Back under the oak tree, your quill-wielding neighbour is still scribbling away, muttering to himself about eyes like candlelight and a voice softer than velvet. He looks up briefly, catches your glance, and turns beet red. Maybe it's for a girl back home. Maybe for the innkeeper's son. Maybe he'll send it. Maybe he'll keep it hidden in his cloak until it fades away with time. But it exists. It matters. Because even in the grimy, rules-heavy world of medieval Europe, people still reached for words. Flawed, flowery, desperate words to say, I feel something. Do you feel it too? Historical fact. In late medieval Europe, love letters and poetry flourished, especially among the literate upper classes, with examples surviving in vernacular languages that express both romantic and emotional intimacy. Quirky fact. Some medieval love letters were written using acrostics, hidden codes, or symbolic language. Early forms of encryption to keep their romantic secrets safe from prying eyes. Debated fact. Historians continue to debate whether emotionally intense letters and poems between three individuals reflect romantic or platonic feelings, as the language of intimacy was often less clearly defined than it is today. Evening falls slow and quiet, like a curtain being drawn gently over the past 1,000 years. You're on the edge of a town that feels both old and strangely new, as if someone took all the dust and rules of the past and stirred them just enough to let a breeze slip through. The streets are paved now, the candles burn steadier, the air carries the faintest scent of lavender soap instead of livestock and old sweat. You can't quite put your finger on it yet, but something is shifting. You've reached the threshold of the Renaissance where ideas begin to glow again, and finally, after centuries of sin and shame, S3X starts to feel human again. Not suddenly, not cleanly, but undeniably. It starts with the art. Because if the medieval world was afraid of the body, the Renaissance was obsessed with it. You walk past a cathedral under renovation, and on the scaffolding painters are bringing saints to life with golden halos and impossibly well-toned abs. Elsewhere, sculptors are chiselling marble torsos that would have made medieval clerics clutch their rosaries in panic. The body becomes visible again, not just as a source of temptation, but as something worthy of admiration, curiosity, and yes, desire. And this isn't just about aesthetics. The Renaissance marks the return of ancient texts, Greek and Roman writings that had long been tucked away, preserved in monasteries or quietly whispered about by scholars. These classical works, once filtered through a Christian lens of condemnation, are now read with new eyes. You hear someone at a tavern quoting Plato, and for the first time, it's not just a theological treatise, it's a conversation about love, longing, even attraction between men, women, and everyone in between. You find books that talk about pleasure, not just as a temptation to be feared, but as a part of life to be understood. Physicians begin to write about anatomy with a little less guesswork. Human cadavers are studied, not for witchcraft, but for science. And while much of this new knowledge is still cloaked in moral language, it's clear that something fundamental is shifting. People want to know the body, not just control it. Even the church, still powerful, finds itself in a delicate dance. It preaches abstinence, virtue, and restraint as always. But the world around it is buzzing with rediscovered texts, sensual art, and quiet rebellions. You hear of priests who write poetry to lovers, monks who become amateur astronomers, nuns who commission portraits that look suspiciously like someone they knew intimately. The edges of orthodoxy are fraying. In homes, people start to talk about love in more personal terms, not just duty or obligation, but affection, compatibility, even attraction. Marriages remain mostly arranged, but with more space, sometimes, for individual choice. A merchant's daughter might still wed to secure an alliance, but she now writes in her diary that her husband smiles kindly and asks about my thoughts. That's a small thing, but it's new. And with love comes the inevitable. It's 3X. Still awkward, still shadowed by centuries of sin, but slightly less suffocating. You overhear whispers about contraception, not the amulets and boiled bark of medieval times, but actual methods being studied and written about in quiet corners of Italy and Spain. Are they effective? Sometimes. Are they trusted? Not really. But they represent a new idea, that people should have agency over their bodies, that pleasure doesn't have to be punishment, Of course, things aren't perfect. Women are still judged more harshly. Men still write manuals on how to manage a wife's sexuality. And superstition hasn't disappeared, it's just been rebranded. But now, alongside the fear, there's curiosity. Alongside the shame, there's dialogue. In Florence, a midwife writes a guide for new mothers that includes not just how to survive childbirth, but how to enjoy your husband again afterward. In Venice, brothels are still operating, but now with a bit more velvet and less outright horror. And you notice something else. The language is changing. Love is no longer described only in terms of suffering or divine torment. It starts to be spoken of as a partnership, a delight, even a source of laughter. You pass a market stall and hear two women gossiping. One tells the other her husband snores like a mule but kisses her like a poet. The other laughs and says, "Lucky you, mine is the other way around." There's a lightness creeping in. Not always, not everywhere, but it's there. A sense that love and pleasure and even S3X can be part of life, not just trials to endure or sins to hide. The Renaissance, after all, isn't just about painting ceilings and inventing perspective. It's about rediscovering being human. Still, don't get too cozy. Some of the old fears stick around like stubborn shadows. The obsession with virginity doesn't vanish overnight. The criminalization of same-3X relationships doesn't stop. It just becomes more nuanced. Women still get blamed for being too tempting, and a flirtatious glance can still ruin a reputation. But now, there are other voices, other stories, other possibilities. You sit by a fountain in the town square watching the candlelight flicker in the windows above. Somewhere nearby, someone is singing. A tune you don't know, but it feels tender. You think about everything you've seen, the hay-strewn cottages with no privacy, the scowling priests, the desperate lovers whispering behind barn doors, the rigid rules and guilt-soaked sermons. And now, here you are, at the edge of something new. The Middle Ages didn't just end, they softened, eroded, transformed. And the way people loved, awkwardly, secretly, desperately, didn't stop. It just adapted. It got louder in some places, softer in others, more dangerous for some, slightly safer for others, but always present. Because people will always find ways to reach for each other, even when the rules say not to. That's the real through line, isn't it? Underneath all the incense and ink, the brothels and sermons, the demons and the dream confessions, was the same human ache, the same want. To be close, to be understood, to be touched. Not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, completely. You take a breath. The breeze smells cleaner now, like the future. Somewhere behind you, a bell rings, not in warning, but like an invitation. Historical fact. The Renaissance brought renewed attention to classical art and literature, leading to a shift in how the human body, desire, and relationships were represented, moving slowly away from medieval suppression toward more open exploration. Quirky fact. Some Renaissance physicians believed that good health in women required a release of seed, leading to the prescription of marital S3X as medicine for melancholy and other ailments. An echo of earlier and questionable ideas. Debated fact. Scholars continue to debate how much daily life actually changed for ordinary people during the early Renaissance, especially regarding sexual norms. Some argue that social freedoms remained limited, while others point to gradually loosening cultural attitudes. And now, here we are. The fire has burned low, the shadows stretched long across the stone floor, and the world outside your window has gone quiet, save for the occasional creak or sigh of wind like it too is ready to call it a night. You've travelled far tonight, through haylofts and cloisters, candlelit bedrooms and dusty confessionals, through whispered secrets and scandalous ballads, all to answer a single, thorny, irresistible question. What was S3X really like in medieval Europe? The truth? Messy, conflicted, hilarious and heartbreaking, sacred and shameful, bound by more rules than common sense. It was a world where desire was treated like a wild animal, sometimes chased, sometimes caged, often blamed for things it didn't do. A world where everyone was expected to play their part, the chaste bride, the faithful husband, the penitent monk, the untouchable widow. But behind those roles, sometimes way behind, sometimes just under the surface, there were real people. People who laughed during awkward moments, who cried over lost loves, who prayed for relief from desire, and sometimes prayed it wouldn't go away. And that's the point, isn't it? Strip away the relics and Latin, and medieval people weren't so different. They longed for connection. They made mistakes. They snuck out at night. They wrote letters they shouldn't have. They said no when they meant yes, and yes when they shouldn't have at all. They were afraid and brave and lonely and loved, just like now. So if tonight's little journey felt strangely familiar, it should, because the rules might change, but the feelings, they stick around. Now close your eyes. Let the candles burn out in your mind one by one. Let the tapestries fade, the bells fall silent, the parchment curl at the corners. The past is done talking for now. And you? You made it all the way through medieval history's secret bedroom door. You deserve a good night's sleep.